The world once froze in silence. A veil of ash hid the sun, turning day into endless night. Oceans withdrew, forests died, and humankind, our fragile ancestors, dwindled to only a few thousand souls. This is not fiction. This is the story of the Ice Age that almost erased us, and the mysterious survivors who kept the spark of humanity alive beneath the cold, unforgiving sky. In the time before time had a name, when the world wore green like a prayer, there lived a people who knew the weight of sunlight on their shoulders. You can almost feel it now, that ancient warmth spreading across your skin, the way morning touched the highlands of what would one day be called Africa, painting everything golden and alive. 74,000 years ago, the earth breathed differently, slower, deeper. The rhythm of seasons moved like a great heart beating beneath the soil, and humanity moved with it, small and precious, as seeds carried on an endless wind. They were few then, perhaps 10,000 souls scattered across a continent that stretched like an open palm toward the sky. Picture them now, these ancestors whose blood runs quiet in your veins. They wake before dawn, as people have always woken, to the sound of birds calling territories into existence. The air tastes of honey and rain promises. Baobab trees stand like ancient monuments, their trunks thick enough to shelter entire families, their branches reaching towards stars that still remember the birth of light. A woman rises from her sleeping place beneath an overhang of warm stone. Her name is lost to us now, blown away on winds that have circled the earth 74,000 times since she drew breath. But her movements are eternal. The careful way she steps around sleeping children, the practiced silence of feet that know every stone and root. She carries fire in a gourd, coals that have burned for longer than memory, passed hand to hand, like a sacred trust. The morning light finds her at the water's edge, where a stream chatters over smooth rocks worn gentle by countless seasons. She cups the water in her palms, drinks deeply, and for a moment, just a moment, you can taste that sweetness yourself. Water that has never known pollution, never carried the chemical songs of a future world. It tastes like earth and sky, and the dreams of clouds. Around her, the world hums with abundance. Fruit trees heavy with offerings bend their branches low. Wild grasses wave seas of gold that stretch to horizons painted soft with distance. Herds of antelope move like flowing rivers across plains that know no fences, no borders, only the ancient laws of drought and plenty, predator and prey. These people live in the spaces between the forest and the savanna, between the seasonal rains and the dry months that teach patience. They follow the herds, but gently, taking only what they need. They gather roots and berries, honey from wild hives, eggs from nests built high in fever trees. Their tools are simple shaped stone and carved bone, thorns that serve as needles, gourds that hold water, and hopes. At night, they gather around fires that dance like small suns against the darkness. The flames throw moving shadows on rock walls, and in those shadows, stories take shape. An old man traces the path of stars with his finger, teaching children the names of constellations that will guide lost travelers home. His voice carries the weight of generations' stories of the first fire, the first rain, the first woman who learned to call lightning down from angry skies. Listen closely, and you can almost hear him speak. His words flow like water over stones, smooth and eternal. He tells of animals that once were people, of trees that hold the spirits of the departed, of mountains that remember the time before time. The children listen with eyes that reflect firelight like deep pools, their young faces serious with the weight of inherited wisdom. In this time, the boundary between human and nature is thin as morning mist. People know the languages of birds, can read the messages written in cloud formations and the color of sunset. They understand that they are part of something larger, threads in a vast tapestry that includes every blade of grass, every drop of rain, every breath of wind that carries the scent of distant flowers. The woman returns to the fire circle as the last light fades from the western sky. She settles beside her partner, a man whose hands are stained with ochre from painting symbols on a rock face handprints that say, "We were here," to a future no one can imagine. Their children sleep curled together like young animals, safe in the circle of warmth and story. Above them, the Milky Way sprawls across a sky so clear you can see the spaces between the stars. The night sounds begin the distant roar of lions, the whooping call of hyenas, the whispered conversation of wind through acacia thorns. But there is no fear here, only the deep peace of people who know their place in the world's great pattern. The fire burns lower, coals glowing red as tiny hearts. Soon the adults will sleep, and the night will belong to other creatures, leopards padding silent through shadows, elephants moving like grey dreams across moonlit plains, hippos rising from river pools to graze under stars. This is the world before the ashes, a world of plenty and peace, where humanity dances on the edge of something magnificent. They do not know that far to the north and east, beyond the curve of the earth, a mountain is growing restless in its sleep. They cannot imagine that beneath their feet, forces older than continents are beginning to stir. For now, there is only this, the eternal now, of firelight and story, of water sweet on the tongue and grass beneath bare feet, the rhythm of breath in sleeping children, the whisper of wind in leaves, the great slow heartbeat of a world that believes it will continue forever. The fire settles into embers, and the last voice fades into the vast symphony of night. Somewhere in the darkness, a nightjar calls its liquid song to the moon. The stars wheel overhead in their ancient dance, marking time with light that began its journey when the world was young. Sleep comes easy in this time, before the ashes, deep and dreamless as the sleep of stones. 4,000 miles to the north and east, where the Indian Ocean cradles a necklace of emerald islands, something ancient stirs beneath the earth. You cannot see it from the African highlands, this restless giant that sleeps beneath what will one day be called Sumatra. But if you could drift like smoke across the curve of the world, you would find yourself hovering above a place where the very bones of the earth are beginning to crack. The mountain has no name yet. Names are human things, and humans have not yet learned to sail the wide waters that separate continents. To the few scattered peoples who live in its shadow, it is simply the fire mountain, the place where the earth breathes heat, and the stones sometimes glow like coals in the darkness. They know its moods the way a mother knows her child's fever, reading the signs in the steam that rises from hidden vents, and the way certain birds refuse to nest on its slopes. But this morning is different. This morning, the mountain's breath comes faster, deep, beneath the tropical forests that cloak its flanks. Something vast and patient begins to move. Magma chambers the size of underground seas shift and swell, fed by currents of molten rock that rise from depths where diamonds form in the crushing dark. The pressure builds slowly, the way a held breath builds in lungs that forget to exhale. If you could descend into those fiery depths, you would find a cathedral of liquid stone, pillars of fire stretching down through layers of the earth's history, written in granite and basalt and compressed time. The first signs are subtle, too subtle for human eyes to read, though other creatures sense the change. Elephants that have followed the same paths for generations suddenly alter their routes, their ancient wisdom whispering warnings in frequencies below human hearing. Birds that normally roost in the mountain's trees take flight at sunset and do not return. Monkeys chatter nervously in the canopy, their calls sharp with an unease they cannot name. A village sits nestled in a valley on the mountain's eastern slope. Small huts woven from bamboo and roofed with palm fronds that rustle like whispers in the morning breeze. The people here are fishers and gatherers, their lives tuned to the rhythm of tides and seasons. They know every reef, every current, every phase of the moon that brings the best catch. An old fisherman mends his nets beside the shore, his weathered hands moving with the unconscious skill of decades. But today his fingers pause, and he lifts his head like an animal scenting danger. The water in the bay seems different, warmer than it should be, with a metallic taste that coats the back of his throat. Tiny bubbles rise from the sandy bottom, in places where no bubbles have risen before. He calls to his son, pointing toward the water with one gnarled finger. They speak in sounds that will vanish from the earth before any human learns to write them down. But the meaning is clear in their gestures, their worried glances toward the mountain that rises behind their village like a sleeping god. That night, the dreams begin. Across the island, people wake gasping from visions of fire and darkness. A young mother clutches her infant closer as images flicker behind her closed eyes. Great wings of ash blotting out the sun, rivers of liquid stone flowing like deadly honey through forests that scream as they die. She does not understand these dreams, cannot interpret the warnings her sleeping mind receives from sources older than consciousness. The mountain's pulse quickens. Deep in its molten heart, gases separate from liquid rock like exhaled breath, creating pockets of superheated steam that search for escape routes through layers of stone laid down over millions of years. Each pocket that forms sends tremors through the earth, so faint that human senses cannot detect them, but sharp enough to make dogs whine and cats refuse to enter certain groves. Miles beneath the surface, in chambers that could swallow cities, the pressure builds toward a threshold that has not been crossed for 73,000 years. The mountain remembers its last awakening, when it painted half the world with ash and brought winter to tropical lands. That memory lives in its stones, in the cooling magma that sealed its throat like a cork in a bottle. But now the cork is weakening, the seal beginning to crack, under pressures that could reshape continents. On the third day, the hot springs grow hotter. Water that once soothed tired muscles now burns skin on contact. Steam rises in greater volumes, carrying with it the sulfur scent of the underworld. Trees near the vents begin to yellow and drop their leaves, though the season is still months away from any natural turning. The people of the valley hold council beneath a moon that seems strangely pale. Elders speak in voices heavy with concern, gesturing toward the mountain that has watched over their families for countless generations. Some speak of moving, following the elephant's wisdom, and seeking safer ground. Others argue for staying, unwilling to abandon the graves of their ancestors, the fishing grounds that have sustained them since the time of their grandmothers' grandmothers. They do not know they are debating the impossible. They do not know that when this mountain truly wakes, there will be no safe ground for thousands of miles. They cannot imagine a sound that will circle the earth 7 times, or darkness that will last for seasons, or ash that will bury entire civilizations beneath grey dunes of powdered stone. As the council continues through the night, the mountain pulses beneath them like a vast heart approaching cardiac arrest. Each beat sends shockwaves through layers of compressed history, through fossils of creatures that lived and died when the world was young, through veins of metal that will never see the Sunday. The fisherman's son has stopped sleeping altogether. He stands at the water's edge through the dark hours, watching phosphorescent plankton draw bright trails in water that grows warmer each night. Behind him, the mountain looms against stars that seem to flicker with an unsteady light. He does not know that he is watching the dying of worlds, the end of an age when humans could believe they were separate from the forces that shaped planets. In the deep places, the pressure builds toward critical mass. Magma chambers swell, like balloons filled past their breaking point. The mountain's breath becomes a pant, then a wheeze, then something approaching a scream that only the earth itself can hear. Somewhere in the African highlands, a woman wakes from dreamless sleep and lifts her head toward a sky still thick with stars. For just a moment, she feels something a tremor in the world's foundation, a disturbance in the great web that connects all living things. But the feeling passes, and she settles back into the warmth of her sleeping place, not knowing that she has just sensed the first whispers of the end of everything she has ever known. The mountain holds its breath, gathering strength for the moment when it will exhale the very fire of creation across a world unprepared for such fierce gifts. Dawn comes red through the steam that rises from 1,000 vents, painting the sky the color of warnings that no human language yet has words to speak. It begins with silence. Not the gentle quiet of morning mist lifting from valleys, but the terrible silence that comes when the earth holds its breath before screaming. Birds that have sung every dawn since the world learned to listen suddenly stop, mid-song. Insects cease their endless humming. Even the wind pauses, as if nature itself knows that something vast and final is about to tear the fabric of the world. The fisherman's son stands at the water's edge and feels the silence settle on his shoulders like a weight. The bay stretches before him, mirror still, reflecting clouds that hang motionless in air thick as honey. No fish break the surface. No waves lap against the shore. The water has turned the color of polished metal. And beneath its surface, he can see creatures floating belly up, their eyes gone white as pearls. Behind him, the mountain trembles, once a single, deep shudder that travels through stone and soil and the roots of trees that have stood for centuries. Then, stillness again, as if the earth is gathering itself for something too large for words. The old fisherman emerges from his hut, his weathered face turned toward the peak that has watched over his family since time began. He has felt earthquakes before, the small shiftings that remind humans of their place in the world's great scheme. But this is different. This tremor carries the weight of finality, the deep note of a bell that will ring only once. In the forests that cloak the mountain slopes, animals flee. Not the slow migration of dry seasons or the purposeful movement of herds following ancient paths, but desperate flight elephants, crashing through undergrowth they would normally navigate with grace. Tigers abandoning territories they have defended for years. Monkeys screaming warnings in languages older than human speech. The pressure beneath the mountain has reached its breaking point. In chambers carved from compressed time, magma rises through throats of stone, carrying with it the fury of the earth's molten heart. Gases separate and expand, creating bubbles of superheated steam that grow larger than cities. The mountain's bedrock, weakened by 73,000 years of patient pressure, begins to crack along fault lines that run deeper than human understanding. At exactly the moment when the sun reaches its zenith, when shadows are small, and the heat of day should be settling over the tropical landscape like a familiar blanket, the mountain erupts. The sound comes first, a roar that begins somewhere in the planet's core and rises through layers of granite and basalt and compressed history until it explodes into the sky with the voice of creation itself. It is not like thunder, which rolls and fades. It is not like the crash of waves against stone, which carries rhythm and repetition. This is the sound of worlds ending, a continuous bellow that shakes clouds from the sky and sends shockwaves racing around the earth at the speed of sound itself. In the valley below, the fisherman and his son feel the sound as much as hear it, a pressure in their bones, a vibration that makes their teeth ache and their vision blur. The ground beneath their feet lurches like a ship in a storm. Bamboo huts collapse as if they were built from dreams. Palm trees snap like twigs in a giant's fist. But the sound is only the beginning. The mountain's peak tears apart like cloth ripping along an invisible seam. What was once a graceful cone crowned with green forests becomes a ragged mouth, vomiting fire and stone into the morning sky. Molten rock, heated to temperatures that would melt iron, shoots upward in a column that grows taller than mountains, higher than clouds, reaching toward the edge of space itself. The eruption column rises with impossible speed, carrying millions of tons of liquefied earth into the atmosphere. At 10 miles high, it spreads outward like an umbrella made from fire and ash. At 20 miles, it begins to block the sunday. At 30 miles, it reaches altitudes where the air is too thin to breathe, where the cold is so intense that even molten stone begins to freeze. From space, if there were eyes to see from such a vantage, the eruption would look like a wound in the earth, a bright scar that spreads and darkens as ash and steam billow outward in an ever-widening circle. But there are no such eyes, only the stars that continue their ancient dance, while below them, one small planet convulses, in pain. On the ground, the world ends in stages. First comes the heat. Superheated gases race down the mountain's slopes faster than horses can run, faster than birds can fly. These pyroclastic flows, glowing red as blood, incinerate everything in their path. Forests that have stood for millennia vanish in seconds, leaving behind only shadows burned into stone. The fisherman's village disappears beneath a wave of fire that turns sand to glass and seawater to steam. The bay itself begins to boil. Fish die in numbers too vast to count, their bodies rising to the surface in silver clouds that stretch to the horizon. The very air catches fire, combusting in brilliant flashes that light the darkening sky like violent aurora. But the true catastrophe is only beginning to unfold. The ash column continues to rise, carrying with it enough pulverized rock to bury continents. What goes up must come down, and when it falls everywhere. The first ash begins to rain over the islands nearest the eruption, not the gentle grey dust of campfires, but a choking storm of glass particles hot enough to sear lungs and sharp enough to blind. Within hours, the ash cloud has spread across hundreds of miles of ocean. Ships that might have sailed these waters in some distant future would find themselves navigating through darkness at midday, their crews gasping for breath in air thick as soup. But there are no ships here, only the endless ocean and the fish that die by the millions, as ash settles like grey snow onto waters that have never known such poison. 4,000 miles away, in the African highlands, where humans sleep in the peace of ignorance, a woman wakes to find her fire burning strangely. The flames, which should be golden and warm, flicker with an odd blue light. The air tastes of metal and distance. She does not know that she is breathing particles of a mountain that exploded while she slept, atoms of stone that traveled faster than weather across the curve of the world. The ash continues to rise and spread. At 40 miles high, it enters the stratosphere, where winds carry it around the globe like a grey river flowing through the sky. What began as a mountain's death scream becomes the Earth's shroud, a blanket of darkness that will dim the sun for years to come. In the Indonesian archipelago, day becomes night in the space of hours. The ash falls so thickly that footprints disappear before the next step can be taken. Villages that survived the initial blast find themselves buried under drifts of grey dust that pile higher than houses. The weight of ash collapses roofs. The particles fill lungs and eyes, and the spaces between thoughts. But even as this local apocalypse unfolds, the greater catastrophe spreads outward like ripples on a poisoned pond. The ash cloud, driven by winds that circle the earth, begins to filter the sunlight that has warmed the planet since life began. What was once brilliant daylight becomes a sickly twilight. What was once warm air begins to cool as less and less solar energy reaches the ground. The fisherman's son, if he had lived to see it, would not recognize the world that emerges from the ash fall. Where once green islands dotted blue seas, now grey wastelands stretch beneath a sky, the color of old pewter. The mountain that gave birth to his ancestors and watched over their fishing boats has become a crater filled with steaming water, a wound in the earth that will take millennia to heal. And this is only the beginning. The ash continues to circle the globe, blocking sunlight, cooling air, changing weather patterns that have remained stable since the last ice age. In the months to come, this grey veil will bring winter to places that have never known snow, famine to lands of plenty, and death to creatures that have flourished since the world was young. But for now, there is only the sound, that endless roar of a planet in agony, a mountain screaming its last breath into a sky that grows darker with each passing hour. Somewhere in the growing gloom, the last light of an age flickers and dies. 3 months after the mountain screamed, the world forgets what blue looks like. The sky, once vast and brilliant as hope itself, has become a ceiling of grey gauze that filters light into something pale and sickly. You can stare directly at the sun now, that burning eye that once commanded worship and fear, and see only a dim disk, the colour of old bones, floating in a sea of ash. The light that reaches the ground carries no warmth, no promise, only the cold reminder that somewhere above the grey veil, a star still burns in a heaven no living thing may see. In the African highlands, where humanity huddles around fires that seem smaller each day, the seasons have lost their names. The rains that should have come with the changing of the winds never arrive. Instead, ash falls like grey snow, coating baobab trees until their ancient bark disappears beneath layers of pulverized mountain. The great herds that once flowed across the grasslands like rivers of life have vanished, leaving behind only bones picked clean by scavengers, grown desperate in a world where prey grows scarcer with each passing moon. The temperature drops first in whispers, then in shouts. Night frost appears where none has touched the earth in human memory. Water that once ran warm from springs begins to steam in the morning air, then stops steaming as even the deep places feel the chill. Children who have never known cold wrap themselves in animal skins and press closer to fires that consume wood faster than forests can regrow it. A grandmother sits beside a dying fire, her weathered hands curved around a bowl of water that shows a skim of ice at its edges. She has lived through 70 seasons, seen drought and plenty, watched the stars wheel through their endless dance. But this is beyond her experience, beyond the wisdom of stories passed down through generations of firelight talk. The ash has coated her hair grey, settled in the lines of her face, turned her world into something alien and strange. She remembers blue. The memory lives behind her eyes like a dream of warmth skies, so clear they seem to ring like bells, water that reflected light instead of swallowing it, grass that grew tall enough to hide a crouching hunter. But when she tries to share these memories with the young ones, they listen with the polite attention given to tales of magic, unable to believe in a world so different from the grey reality they inhabit. Across the cooling earth, the volcanic winter tightens its grip like a fist slowly closing. In lands that once knew only the gentle alternation of wet and dry seasons, snow falls for the first time in geological ages. The white crystals, mixed with ash, create a slush, the color of dirty concrete, that coats everything in a layer of frozen misery. Plants that have thrived under tropical suns begin to yellow and die. Not the graceful dying of autumn, with its explosions of color and promise of renewal, but the sudden collapse of organisms pushed beyond their capacity to adapt. Fruit trees that should be heavy, with offerings stand bare and skeletal. Fields of grass turn brown, then black, then disappear altogether, beneath drifts of ash and snow. The great forests begin to thin. Trees that have stood for centuries, their canopies home to countless creatures, start to shed their leaves in a desperate attempt to conserve energy. But the ash that coats every surface blocks the photosynthesis that feeds their roots. Gradually, inevitably, they begin to die from the crown down, their naked branches reaching toward a sun that no longer shines with sufficient strength to sustain them. In the oceans, where the ash falls, like grey rain onto waters that once sparkled under brilliant skies, entire ecosystems collapse. Microscopic plants that form the base of all marine life, starved of sunlight, die in numbers too vast to comprehend. Their death sends shockwaves up the food chain. Small fish die, then larger fish, then the great sea mammals that have sung their songs in these waters since the world was young. Whales beach themselves on shores they have never touched, their sonar confused by waters that no longer carry familiar sounds. Dolphins swim in circles, calling for pods that will never answer. The very chemistry of the sea begins to change as volcanic gases dissolve into water that grows more acidic with each passing day. On land, the great migrations cease. Herds that have followed the same paths for millions of years find their traditional routes blocked by snowfall and ash drifts. Elephants, those ancient wanderers whose memory holds the wisdom of countless generations, stand confused at the edges of ranges that have become alien landscapes. Their matriarchs, repositories of knowledge stretching back through centuries of seasons, find their guidance useless in a world that no longer follows any recognizable pattern. The predators suffer as their prey disappears. Lions that once ruled vast territories find themselves competing for the scattered remnants of herds that have dwindled to nothing. Their roars, which once announced dominion over endless savanna, become thin and desperate in air that carries no scent of the abundance they remember. In caves and rock shelters, human families burn their last reserves of carefully gathered wood. The fires that once seemed eternal, passed from hand to hand since the first spark was stolen from lightning, begin to flicker and fade. People venture out into the grey world to search for fuel, but the trees that remain standing are often too green to burn well, and the dry wood of dead trees has been claimed by others equally desperate. A young hunter, his ribs showing through skin that once covered muscle, tracks the footprints of an antelope through ash that muffles all sound. The trail leads him across landscapes that look like the surface of an alien world. Grey dunes, sculpted by winds that carry no scent of life. Trees that stand like charcoal sketches against a sky the color of pewter. He follows the tracks for days, his stomach clenching with hunger. But the antelope he seeks has vanished like a dream, into the endless grey. The cold reaches deeper with each passing week. Ice forms on water that has flowed warm since the continents settled into their current dance. In highlands that once knew only the gentle chill of early morning, frost kills insects and small mammals whose bodies were never designed for such temperatures. The very soil begins to freeze, locking nutrients away from the roots of plants that still struggle to survive. Children who have never seen snow touch the white crystals with wonder, not understanding that they are witnessing the Earth's fever breaking into something like death. Their laughter echoes strangely in air that has grown thick and still, sound traveling differently through atmosphere heavy with suspended particles of a mountain that died 4,000 miles away. But perhaps the most profound change is in the silence. The world has grown quiet in ways that go beyond the mere absence of sound. The constant chatter of insects has stopped. The evening chorus of birds no longer marks the transition from day to night. Even the wind seems muted, as if the very air has grown tired of carrying sound through a landscape that no longer knows how to listen. In this silence, humans begin to understand their place in the world's great pattern. They are not separate from the forces that shape planets. They are not masters of a nature that exists to serve them. They are part of something vast and fragile, a web of connection that can unravel with the dying of a single mountain 4,000 miles away. The ash continues to circle the earth, carried by winds that know no borders. Each particle tells the story of stone that once stood solid beneath tropical skies, now powdered and scattered across a world that grows colder and darker with each passing day. Somewhere in the grey twilight that has become perpetual noon, a child asks her mother when the sun will come back. The mother holds her close and speaks of patience, of seasons that will turn again, of light that hides behind clouds, but never truly dies. But in her heart, she wonders if the sun remembers how to shine. The fire burns lower now, and there are fewer hands to feed it. In a cave overlooking what was once a valley green with promise, 17 people huddle around embers that glow like the last stars in a dying universe. They are all that remain of a tribe that once numbered in the hundreds, all that survive of a lineage stretching back through generations countless as grains of sand. Their breath makes small clouds in air that has grown cold enough to kill, and in those clouds you can see the visible evidence of humanity's retreat from a world that no longer recognizes them as its children. The old woman who remembers blue skies died 3 days ago. She passed quietly in her sleep, her last words a whisper about light that danced on water like scattered diamonds. They buried her in ground so hard with frost that they had to build fires on the earth before they could dig, melting their way down to soil that would accept her bones. With her went stories that will never be told again, songs that will never again rise towards stars hidden behind veils of ash. This is the mathematics of extinction, written in numbers too small to comfort. Where once tens of thousands of humans walked the Earth's far places, now perhaps 3,000 remain scattered across continents that have become hostile to everything warm-blooded and hopeful. Maybe 4,000, maybe fewer. No one knows for certain, because the distances between survivor groups have grown too vast to cross, and the world has become too dangerous for the casual travel that once carried news and stories from band to band. In caves and rock shelters across Africa, small groups of humans make their last stands against a winter that shows no sign of ending. They burn everything that will burn: furniture made from carefully shaped wood, tools that took generations to perfect, even the wooden handles of spears that once brought down great beasts. The smoke rises through cracks in stone ceilings and disperses into a sky that no longer carries the scent of life. A young mother nurses her infant by firelight, her body thin with hunger but still managing to produce the milk that keeps her child alive. The baby's eyes, large in a face grown gaunt with the universal hunger of these grey days, reflect the flames like dark pools holding the last light in the world. She sings to him in a voice barely above a whisper, lullabies that speak of green places and warm rain, of animals that once grazed in herds, so vast they darkened the earth with their passage. The milk she gives comes from her own diminishing reserves, calories burned from muscles that grow smaller each day. But she continues to nurse, continues to sing, continues to believe that the small warm weight in her arms represents something more than just another mouth to feed, in a world where food has become memory. The hunters return, empty-handed again. They have been gone for 5 days, ranging farther from the cave than anyone has dared venture since the ash began to fall. Their report is delivered in words that carry the weight of finality. No tracks in the grey snow, no sign of the herds that once thundered across these highlands like earthbound clouds. Even the scavengers have vanished. The hyenas and vultures that once cleaned the bones of the dead have themselves become bones scattered across a landscape that looks like the surface of a dead moon. The youngest hunter, barely past the age when boys become men, speaks of what he has seen in the far valleys. Forests where every tree stands like a blackened spear thrust up from grey earth. Rivers frozen solid, their ice the colour of old bone. And silence, a silence so complete that it seems to have weight, pressing down on the world like a blanket woven from all the sounds that will never be made again. The tribe's shaman, keeper of the old knowledge, sits apart from the others and stares into flames that seem to grow smaller each time they are fed. His painted face, once bright with ochre and hope, has faded to the colour of ash. The bones he once cast to read the future lie silent in a pouch made from the hide of an animal whose species may no longer exist. What is the point of divination in a world where every future leads to the same grey ending? But even he, old and worn as driftwood, polished by impossible tides, does not know how close humanity has come to the final darkness. Across the cooling earth, the mathematics of survival work themselves out in numbers that would terrify gods. Birth rates have plummeted as women's bodies, starved of nutrition, cease their monthly cycles. Children die in their sleep, their small hearts simply stopping in the cold that penetrates even the deepest caves. In other shelters, other fires burn low around other small groups of survivors. A band of 8 in what will one day be called the Cape of Good Hope. 11 souls huddled in a cave system near the source of a river that once ran clear and warm. 13 people in highland Ethiopia, burning the last of the juniper trees that their ancestors held sacred. Each group believes they may be the last humans alive, unaware that across the vast distances of a continent, others maintain their own desperate vigils. The genetic diversity of an entire species, built up over hundreds of thousands of years of expansion and exploration, contracts to a few thousand individuals carrying the accumulated wisdom and potential of all who came before. If humanity survives this bottleneck, they will carry within their blood the memories of this time coded in DNA, written in the deep structures of cells, a story of endurance that will echo through every generation that follows. A child asks the question that burns in every heart but rarely finds voice. When will the world come back? The adults exchange glances heavy with knowledge they cannot share. How do you tell a child that the world they remember may be gone forever? How do you explain that the green places and warm rains they sing about in lullabies may exist now only in the realm of story and dream? The fire burns lower, and they feed it with the last chair their grandfather made, the wood carved with patterns that tell the story of trees and rivers and animals that lived when the world was young. The flames dance higher for a moment, throwing moving shadows on cave walls painted with the handprints of ancestors who could never have imagined that their children's children would burn their heritage just to stay warm for one more night. Outside the cave, the wind carries ash across landscapes, scoured bare of everything that once made them recognizable. Snow falls mixed with particles of volcanic glass, each flake a tiny messenger from a mountain that died to teach the world about the fragility of all things. The accumulation builds higher each day, burying the bones of a world that once believed itself eternal. In the depths of the cave, where the firelight cannot reach, older paintings emerge from the darkness, when flames flicker just right. Ancient handprints pressed into stone by people who lived and loved, and told stories around fires that burned when mammoths walked the earth. The cave has sheltered humans before, through ice ages and droughts, and the long cycles of climate that have shaped the world since continents learned to dance. But those who painted their hands on these walls could never have foreseen this a winter, caused not by the slow march of glaciers, but by the sudden death of a mountain 4,000 miles away. They could not have imagined their descendants burning the last remnants of civilization just to see the next dawn. The baby falls asleep in his mother's arms, his breathing so quiet it can barely be heard above the whisper of wind through cracks in stone. His dreams, if infants dream, are perhaps of warmth and plenty, of milk that flows without hunger, of voices raised in joy, rather than whispered in the hope of not attracting the attention of a world that has grown hostile to human happiness. The fire burns lower still, and the mother pulls her child closer, sharing what warmth her body can provide. Around them, the 17 survivors of 10,000 generations settle into sleep that may or may not lead to another dawn. They sleep, the sleep of the almost extinct, balanced on the knife edge between existence and the final darkness that has claimed so many of their kind. But they sleep nonetheless. And in their sleeping, in their breathing, in the steady beating of hearts that refuse to stop despite all reason, humanity persists. 3,000 souls scattered across a continent that has become a stranger to hope. Maybe 4,000, maybe fewer, but still, they breathe. Still, they dream. Still, they tend fires that burn like tiny stars against the vast darkness that has swallowed the world. And in their persistence, in their refusal to surrender to the silence that has claimed so much, lies the seed of everything that will come after all the cities that will rise, all the songs that will be sung, all the children who will play under skies blue, as promise and bright as hope itself. The fire burns lower, but it does not die. Not yet. The decision to leave comes like dawn after the longest night slowly, then all at once, bringing with it the terrible clarity of those who have nothing left to lose. The 17 souls in the Highland cave wake to find frost covering the inside walls, ice crystals that have formed from their own breath during the cold hours before dawn. The fire that has sustained them through 3 seasons of grey winter has dwindled to a handful of embers that glow like the last thoughts of dying stars. There is no more wood to burn, no more furniture to sacrifice to the hungry flames. Even the bone handles of their tools have been fed to fires that grow smaller each day. The youngest among them, a girl whose name means morning star in a language that may die with her, traces patterns in the frost with her finger. The ice melts at her touch, leaving trails that look like the rivers she remembers from stories told by grandmothers who knew the world when it was green. She does not understand that she is creating the first maps of their exodus, drawing the paths they must follow if any of them are to see another year. The decision-maker is not the strongest among them, nor the oldest, but a woman whose calm in the face of impossible choices has made her the heart around which the others orbit. Her name translates roughly as she who sees far, though now there is little to see beyond the grey curtain that has fallen across the world. When she speaks, her voice carries the weight of all the decisions that have brought them to this moment. We follow the water, she says simply, and in those 4 words lies the strategy that will save what remains of humanity. The river that once flowed past their valley has dwindled to a trickle, but it still moves, still carries the memory of sources, somewhere in the highlands, where snow melts, even in this endless winter. If they follow it downstream, it will lead them toward the great waters that their ancestors spoke of in stories, lakes and rivers fed by springs that rise from deep places in the earth, places where the cold cannot reach. They pack what little they have left, tools made from stone and bone, carefully shaped and sharpened, and carried from camp to camp across distances measured in generations. Skins scraped thin and soft, sewn together with sinew, to make garments that trap what little warmth their bodies can produce. Fire-making materials, precious as life itself, dry tinder, wrapped in waterproof hides, flint knapped to perfect edges, the skills to coax flame from cold stone and dead wood. Each step away from the cave is a prayer to the sun they can no longer see clearly. Each footprint in the ash-covered ground marks a distance traveled not just in space, but in hope. The hope that somewhere ahead lies something better than slow death in familiar surroundings. They walk in single file, the strongest breaking trail through drifts of volcanic ash mixed with snow, the others following in footsteps that will be erased by wind before the day is done. The landscape they traverse looks like the surface of an alien world, where once grasslands rolled like green seas toward distant horizons. Now grey dunes sculpted by constant wind stretch beneath a sky the colour of old pewter. The trees that still stand are leafless spears thrust up from frozen ground, their bark scarred by ash-laden winds that scrape like sandpaper against anything that dares to rise above the general desolation. They find the bones first scattered white markers of the herds that once thundered across these plains in numbers too vast to count. Elephant skulls the size of boulders, their ivory tusks cracked by frost and carved by wind into sculptures that speak of grace, lost to time. Zebra skeletons still arranged as if the animals died in their sleep, curled together for warmth that never came. The bones of lions and hyenas mixed with those of their prey, predator and victim, united in the democracy of extinction. But bones can be tools for those desperate enough to see possibility in death. They select the strongest femurs that can serve as digging sticks, ribs that can be shaped into needles, skulls that can hold water or serve as vessels for the coals they carry with them like sacred fire. Each bone becomes part of their survival, another day bought with the remnants of the world that was. The woman who sees far reads the landscape like a text written in languages older than words. She points to a distant ridge where the ash lies thinner, evidence of winds that blow differently there. She traces the path of the dying river with her finger, following its course toward lowlands that might still hold water and the promise of life. Her knowledge comes not from books that will not be written for thousands of years, but from the deep wisdom of people who have learned to read the earth like the lines on their own palms. They walk through days that never truly become day, through a twilight that stretches from dawn to dusk without variation. The sun, when they can glimpse it through the ash-heavy sky, appears as a pale disk no brighter than the moon once seemed. It provides no warmth, no comfort, only the faint reassurance that somewhere above the grey veil, the fires of heaven still burn. At night, they huddle together in whatever shelter they can find, rock overhangs that provide some protection from wind, dried creek beds that offer slight refuge from the constant fall of ash. They share body heat like currency, the warmth of one becoming the life of all. The children sleep in the center of the group, surrounded by adults who give their own warmth to keep the future alive. The hunger is constant now, a companion that walks with them every step. They eat what they can find, roots excavated from frozen ground, bark peeled from trees that may already be dead, insects discovered in the protected spaces between stones. Everything edible has been consumed by creatures more desperate than themselves, leaving only the hard choices between starvation and poisoning, between the known and the unknown. But they discover something unexpected in there: hunger, the human capacity to find sustenance in things that are not food. Stories become nourishment for spirits that threaten to fail along with bodies. The woman who sees far tells tales of the time before the grey, when rain fell warm and sweet, when fruit hung heavy on trees that knew how to be green. Her words carry calories for the soul, energy that keeps feet moving when muscles forget how to work. A young man, barely past the age when boys learn to hunt, begins to sing as they walk. His voice, thin with hunger but still carrying melody, rises into the grey air like smoke from an invisible fire. The song has no words that translate to meaning, only sounds that remind them of what it feels like to be human. Others join their voices to his, creating harmonies that warm the spaces between breath, that make the distances between heartbeats feel less empty. They follow the river for days that blend into weeks, watching it grow smaller as they descend toward lands that once knew warmth. Sometimes they find pools where fish still move sluggishly beneath ice thin as glass. The fish are slow, stunned by cold that never lifts. Easy prey for people quick enough to break the ice and grab with hands that have learned to ignore pain. Each fish becomes a feast shared 17 ways, bones, and all consumed by people who have learned that survival means wasting nothing. They eat the scales and the eyes, the parts that once would have been discarded without thought. They crack the bones and suck the marrow, extract every molecule of nutrition from creatures that gave their lives to keep human dreams alive a little longer. The river leads them through landscapes that grow stranger with each passing day. Valleys where ice has formed in fantastic shapes, towers and bridges, and cathedrals of frozen water that speak of temperatures beyond human experience. Forests where every tree stands coated in ice thick as a man's arm, their branches transformed into crystal sculptures that tinkle like distant bells when wind moves through them. But gradually, almost imperceptibly, things begin to change. The river grows slightly larger, rather than smaller. The ice becomes thinner. The ash that falls from the sky carries less of the bitter taste that burns throats and eyes. And one morning, as they wake in a sheltered valley beside water that actually flows, rather than standing frozen, someone points to the eastern horizon and whispers a word that has almost been forgotten. Look, there, barely visible through the grey veil that has covered the world for so long, a faint glow appears where the sun should rise. Not bright enough to cast shadows, not warm enough to melt frost, but unmistakably light. Actual light breaking through the ash-heavy sky like hope made visible. They stand together beside the moving water and watch that faint glow strengthen, minute by minute, until individual faces can be seen clearly for the first time in months. The woman who sees far places her hand on the shoulder of the girl who draws maps in frost, and in that gesture, you can see the passing of knowledge from one generation to the next, the continuation of wisdom that refuses to die even when the world seems determined to end. The river flows on, carrying them toward destinations they cannot imagine, toward futures they are only beginning to dare hope for. And for the first time since the mountain screamed its death song into the sky, their footsteps carry the rhythm, not of flight, but of pilgrimage towards something that might, possibly, be called home. Hunger. 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 The word beats, like a drum beneath their ribs, echoes in the hollow spaces, where hope used to live. It pounds with the rhythm of hearts that pump blood thin by starvation, keeps time with footsteps that grow lighter, not from joy but from the gradual consumption of muscle and bone, and the very substance of dreams. 3 weeks since they left the cave. 3 weeks following water that leads them through a world stripped bare of everything that once made survival possible. The faint light they glimpsed that first morning has strengthened slightly, but not enough to warm the air that burns their lungs with each breath, not enough to melt the ice that forms in their hair while they sleep. Hunger. 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 The old man falls first. Not the oldest among them. That honor belongs to a woman whose memory holds stories from before the great herds learned to migrate, but the one whose body has given all it can give. He stops walking without warning, simply sits down in the ash-covered path, as if he has reached his intended destination. His eyes hold no pain, only a kind of peaceful exhaustion that comes to those who have carried burdens too heavy for human shoulders. I will rest here, he says. And everyone understands that this rest will last longer than winter, longer than the grey sky, that shows no sign of clearing. They cannot carry him. Their own bodies are too diminished for such kindness. They cannot stay with him. Stopping means death, for all of them. So they do what humans have always done when faced with impossible choices. They love him as well as they can in the time they have left. The woman who sees far kneels beside him and places her hand on his forehead. The gesture is ancient, older than language, a blessing that passes between generations like fire from one torch to another. She speaks his name, the sound of it carrying all the weight of a life, lived fully in a world that has forgotten how to be generous. The children gather around him, these small ones who have never known plenty, but who have learned to find wealth in moments. They share with him their most precious possessions, smooth stones warmed by small hands, drawings scratched in bark that show animals they have heard about in stories, a shell carried from the coast by grandparents who walked beside seas that still sparkled blue, and then they leave him there, sitting beside the path with his face turned toward the faint glow in the eastern sky. They leave him because staying would mean joining him, and someone must carry forward the stories that live in their bones, the knowledge that pulses in their blood, the possibility that somewhere ahead waits a world ready to remember how to breathe. Hunger. 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 The rhythm follows them down valleys where rivers once ran full and forests once grew green. It beats in time with the crunch of frost beneath their feet, matches the cadence of breath that comes harder now, more labored. Each inhalation a conscious act of will, rather than the unconscious gift it once was. They eat anything that might contain life. Bark peeled from trees that may already be dead, the inner wood scraped with stones, and chewed, until their jaws ache. Roots excavated from ground frozen hard as stone, bitter with compounds that make their stomachs clench, but might carry enough energy to fuel another day's walking. Even the leather of their own clothing becomes food, cut into strips and boiled in water heated with stones pulled from fires they can barely afford to build. The woman who remembers the most stories begins to forget. Not all at once, not dramatically, but in small losses that accumulate like snowfall. She reaches for words that have slipped away, fumbles for the endings of tales that once flowed from her lips like water from springs. The others watch her forgetting, with the kind of terror reserved for those who understand what they are witnessing, the death of memory itself, the gradual erasure of everything their ancestors knew. But forgetting brings its own mercy. Pain becomes distant when the mind lacks the energy to hold it clearly. The constant ache of hunger fades to background noise, like wind that blows so steadily you stop hearing it. Even grief becomes manageable when consciousness dims enough to soften its sharp edges. The children adapt with the frightening resilience of the young. They invent games that require no energy word, puzzles that exercise minds, while bodies rest, riddles that turn starvation into entertainment. They create elaborate fantasies about the foods they will eat when the world returns to itself, describing flavors and textures with the precision of poets, making banquets from imagination, when reality offers only empty bowls. A boy whose ribs now show clearly through skin, stretched tight, begins to tell stories about his stomach. He gives it a name, speaks to it like a pet that has grown unruly but is still beloved. "Quiet now, Rumble," he whispers when it growls loud enough for others to hear. "Tomorrow we will find you something sweet." His humor becomes sustenance for the group, laughter that costs nothing, but provides warmth that no fire can match. But hunger takes more than flesh. It gnaws at the connections between people, frays the bonds that hold communities together. Arguments flare over portions that wouldn't satisfy a sparrow, over who carries more weight, over decisions that in better times would be made easily and with consensus. The stress of starvation reveals the fault lines in human relationships, exposes the places where cooperation might crack under pressure. Yet it also reveals something else, the depths of love that exist between people who have chosen to face the end of the world together. Parents give their portions to children without thought, without drama, as naturally as they breathe. The strong carry the burdens of the weak without being asked. When someone stumbles, hands reach out to steady them, before consciousness even registers the need. A mother whose milk dried up weeks ago still holds her infant close, still rocks him when he cries from hunger she cannot satisfy. The child grows lighter in her arms each day, his cries becoming weaker, but she continues to sing. The lullabies her own mother sang, continues to promise warm milk and honey cakes and all the abundance that exists now only in the realm of song. The songs themselves begin to change. Melodies that once celebrated plenty and joy become dirges for the dying world, laments for the green places that may exist now only in memory. But even the saddest songs carry something vital, the proof that humans still have voices to sing with, still have stories worth preserving, still believe that somewhere ahead lies someone who needs to hear what they have learned about surviving the impossible. Hunger, hunger, hunger. The drumbeat grows fainter as they descend toward lower ground, following water that moves more freely here, that carries the scent of places where ice has begun to thin. The river speaks to them in languages older than words, tells them of springs hidden in valleys, of pools where fish might still swim sluggishly beneath ice that fractures when touched. They find bones scattered along the riverbank, not the clean white monuments to extinction they discovered in the highlands, but fresher remains that speak of more recent deaths. Antelope that died perhaps weeks rather than months ago, their bones still holding traces of marrow, their hides not yet completely claimed by scavengers that have vanished into the grey hunger of this endless winter. The discovery brings them their first real meal in more days than anyone has strength left to count. They crack bones with stones, extract every drop of nutrition from remains that would have disgusted them in the time before the ash. They scrape hides clean and boil them into a broth that tastes like life itself, like the memory of what it feels like to have a stomach that doesn't ache constantly with emptiness. For the first time in weeks, the drumbeat of hunger quiets enough for other sounds to emerge. Conversation returns to voices that had been reduced to essential words only. Laughter resurfaces, tentative at first, then growing stronger, as bellies remember what it feels like to contain something other than acid and hope. And, in that moment of relative plenty, sitting beside a river that actually flows rather than standing frozen, they make a discovery that will change everything. The woman who sees far, using a bone tool to probe the muddy bank for anything edible, strikes something that is not stone, not bone, not any of the familiar debris of this dying world. Warmth, rising from the earth itself, water that steams in the cold air, earth that remains unfrozen even when the sky drops ash mixed with snow. The hot spring bubbles up from depths where the cold cannot reach, where the earth's own heart still beats with the rhythm of creation rather than destruction. They stare at the steaming water with the wonder of people who have rediscovered magic, who have stumbled upon proof that somewhere beneath the grey surface of this dying world, life still moves with its ancient rhythms. The water is too hot to touch directly, but it warms the air around it, creates a pocket of space, where breath doesn't freeze and skin doesn't burn with cold. The mother with the dying infant kneels beside the spring and lets the steam warm her child's face. For a moment, just a moment, the baby's eyes open wide and clear, and he makes a sound that might be laughter, or might be the first word of a language that will survive the winter and grow into stories that will be told around fires when the world learns to be green again. The drumbeat of hunger continues, will continue for days and weeks to come, but it no longer beats alone. Now it keeps time with something else, the steady pulse of hot water rising from depths that remember what it means to be alive, the rhythm of a world that has not forgotten how to breathe. The cave breathes, not with the labored gasps of the dying, but with the deep, steady rhythm of something that has been sleeping and is just beginning to wake. Warm air flows from its mouth, like the exhalation of a sleeping giant, carrying with it the scent of stone, heated by fires that burn far below the surface of the world. When the 17 survivors first glimpse it, a dark opening in a hillside where no ice forms and no ash settles, they understand that they have found something miraculous. The entrance yawns before them like a doorway to another world, one where the laws that govern the grey wasteland above do not apply. Steam rises from the cave mouth in visible clouds, warm enough to melt snowflakes before they can touch the ground. The rock around the opening is dark with moisture, not the white rime of frost that coats everything else in this dying landscape. The woman who sees far approaches the entrance with the caution of one who has learned that in a world turned hostile, even gifts can carry hidden thorns. She places her hand on the stone beside the opening and feels warmth seeping through rock that should be frozen solid. The sensation travels up her arm like electricity, like the memory of what it feels like to be truly warm. And for a moment her eyes close with something approaching prayer. "The earth remembers," she whispers, and the words carry more weight than any blessing spoken in temples that will not be built for thousands of years. They enter the cave like pilgrims approaching a shrine, single file, hands trailing along walls that radiate gentle heat. The passage slopes downward into darkness that feels welcoming rather than threatening, darkness that promises shelter rather than danger. Behind them, the grey world of ash and ice recedes until it seems like nothing more than a bad dream that will fade with the coming of light. The tunnel opens into a chamber that takes their breath away. Water pools in natural basins carved from living rock, heated by springs that rise from depths where the earth's blood still runs hot. Steam rises from the surface in gentle spirals, carrying minerals that paint the cave walls in colors they had almost forgotten existed, reds and yellows and oranges that speak of life, of heat, of a world that still knows how to create beauty. The water is warm enough to soak in, hot enough to drive away the cold that has lived in their bones for months. They undress with reverent care, removing layers of hide and fur that have not left their bodies since the ash began to fall. Their skin, revealed in the warm air for the first time in an age, is pale and thin, stretched tight over bones that show too clearly the cost of survival. But in the warm water, they begin to remember what it feels like to be human, rather than merely survivors. The heat penetrates muscles, that have been clenched against cold for so long, they had forgotten how to relax. Blood flows more freely, carrying warmth to extremities that had grown numb with the constant battle against freezing. For the first time in months, they can breathe deeply without pain, can move without the stiffness that comes from bodies held rigid against killing cold. The children enter the water with squeals of delight that echo from the cave walls like music. They splash and play with an energy that has been dormant since the world grew grey, their laughter rising with the steam toward a ceiling lost in darkness above. The sound fills the chamber with something that has been absent from their lives for so long they had almost forgotten its name: joy. The cave extends far beyond the main chamber, branching into passages that lead to other pools, other wonders. In one branch, they discover walls covered with formations that grow, like flowers made of stone stalactites and stalagmites that have been building themselves drop by drop for millennia, creating gardens of mineral beauty in the warm darkness. In another passage, water flows in a constant stream, heated by its journey through the earth's deep places, providing fresh water that tastes of nothing but purity. But perhaps the most precious discovery is the flat, smooth floor of the main chamber, covered with a thin layer of mineral deposits that makes it ideal for something they have not dared to do since leaving their highland refuge. They can build a fire that will not be stolen by wind, that will not consume itself fighting against the endless cold of the outside world. They gather around the fire like worshippers around an altar, feeding it with driftwood carried by underground streams, wood that has been seasoned by mineral water until it burns clean and bright. The flames dance on the cave walls, throwing moving shadows that transform the stone formations into an audience of spirits watching over their rest. For the first time in months, they eat warm food. Fish caught in pools where geothermal vents create environments untouched by the volcanic winter above. Roots and tubers that still grow in the heated earth near hot springs. Even mushrooms that flourish in the warm, humid air of the deeper passages. Pale, delicate things that taste like the promise of spring. The woman who has been forgetting her stories finds that in the warmth and safety of the cave, memory begins to return. Words that had slipped away resurface, like objects floating up from deep water. She tells tales of the time before time, when the earth was young and mountains learned to dance, when rivers ran warm with the joy of new creation. Her voice grows stronger with each story, fed by the warmth that surrounds them, nourished by the knowledge that finally, they have found a place where stories can be told without fear of their words freezing in the air. The children listen with the intensity of those who understand they are receiving something precious. In the firelight, their faces lose the gaunt look of starvation, begin to remember what it looks like to be young rather than merely small survivors. They ask questions, make connections, weave the old stories together with their own experiences until new tales emerge. Stories of the journey through ash and ice, of the mountain that screamed, and the sky that forgot how to be blue. A young man whose voice had been the first to rise in song during their march begins to sing again, but now his songs are different. Where once they carried only the determination to survive, now they hold something else. Gratitude for warmth, wonder at beauty, rediscovered, hope that if one warm place exists in the grey world, others might be found. The cave becomes more than shelter, it becomes home. They explore its passages, learning its moods and seasons. They discover that different pools hold different temperatures, that some chambers are better for sleeping, while others are perfect for the work of tool making and food preparation. They find places where the cave art of even more ancient peoples decorates the walls, handprints pressed into stone by humans who lived here when mammoths walked the earth. Proof that this place has always been a refuge for those who needed the earth's warmth to survive. The mother whose infant had grown so thin begins to produce milk again, as her body responds to warmth and regular food. The baby's cries, which had grown weaker each day during their journey, become strong and demanding once more. The sound of a healthy, hungry child echoes through the chambers, like a bell announcing that life will continue, that the future has not been cancelled after all. They begin to heal in ways that go beyond the physical. Arguments that had erupted during the hungry days of travel fade, as full bellies and warm bodies remember how to be generous with each other. Laughter returns, then singing, Then the kind of easy conversation that happens when people are not constantly calculating how many calories each word costs to speak. In the deeper chambers, they make discoveries that will change everything they think they know about their place in the world. Cave paintings that show not just animals and hunting scenes, but symbols, marks that seem to carry meaning beyond mere representation. Patterns carved into stone that repeat with the kind of precision that speaks of conscious design rather than accident. An old woman whose hands remember the skill of shaping bone into tools finds herself drawn to these symbols. In the warm air that allows fine work to be done without numbed fingers, she begins to experiment with making marks of her own. Lines that represent the journey they have taken. Circles that stand for the cave, for warmth, for the return of hope. Simple symbols that carry complex meanings. The beginning of a language that speaks in images rather than sounds. The cave becomes a womb of rebirth, a place where humanity can remember not just how to survive, but how to create, how to think beyond the immediate needs of hunger and cold. In its warm chambers, they rediscover the part of being human that goes beyond mere biological persistence, the drive to make meaning from experience, to transform survival into story, to find in the darkest times the seeds of whatever light will come after. Outside, the grey world continues its slow dying. Ash still falls from skies that remember no other colour. Ice still covers landscapes that once knew green. But inside the cave, in the warm darkness that breathes with the earth's own life, 17 human souls begin to remember what it means to hope. The fire burns brighter here, fed by air that carries no chill, reflected by walls that hold heat like a blessing. And around that fire, stories begin to take new shape, tales that will carry them through whatever darkness remains, legends that will be passed down through generations yet to be born, myths that will remember this time, when humans learned that even in the coldest winter, the earth's heart still beats warm and strong enough to shelter those who know how to listen. In the beginning was the mark, not word, not sound, but the simple act of pressing meaning into stone, of taking the chaos of experience and giving it shape that eyes can read and minds can hold. Around the fire that burns without threat of wind or cold, in chambers warmed by the earth's own breath, something new is being born from the marriage of human need and human ingenuity. The old woman whose hands remember how to shape bone into tools has become something else in this warm sanctuary beneath the grey world. Her fingers, freed from the constant battle against numbing cold, rediscover the precision that once made her the finest tool maker in her village. But now she shapes more than implements. She shapes meaning itself, pressing it into soft stone with points of heated bone until symbols emerge that carry weight beyond their simple lines. She begins with the circle. Not the perfect geometry that will one day grace temples and palaces, but the rough, breathing circle that speaks of wholeness, of completion, of the womb that shelters life until it is ready to be born. With charcoal pulled from the fire's heart, she draws circles on cave walls that have waited millions of years for such decoration. Each circle becomes a word in a language that has no sounds, a sentence in a story that unfolds in images rather than breath. The children gather around her as she works, drawn by the magic of watching meaning take shape beneath human hands. They do not understand what she is creating, cannot read the symbols that flow from her fingers like water from a spring. But they sense significance in the careful way she chooses each mark, in the reverent silence that settles over her when she works, in the way her eyes hold the focused intensity of a shaman calling spirits into visible form. "Tell me what you see," she says to the boy, whose ribs no longer show quite so clearly, whose games with hunger have evolved into something approaching normal childhood play. She points to a series of marks she has made on a smooth section of wall lines that intersect and curve, dots that cluster in patterns that seem random but carry the weight of intention. The boy studies the marks with the seriousness of one who understands he is being tested, not for knowledge but for something deeper. His eyes move across the symbols, like fingers, reading texture, searching for the story that lives beneath the surface of stone and charcoal. "Fire," he says finally, pointing to a cluster of lines that radiate from a central point. "Water," touching a series of curved marks that flow across the stone like a river frozen in time. People, indicating dots, arranged in the rough circle of bodies, gathered around a flame. The old woman nods, and in that simple gesture lives the birth of literacy, the moment when humans first understand that marks on stone can carry the same weight as words spoken aloud. But this is more than writing in any sense that future civilizations will recognize. This is visual thinking made manifest, the translation of experience into symbols that can survive the death of those who create them. Others begin to experiment with mark making, each developing their own vocabulary of symbols, their own ways of pressing experience into forms that eyes can hold. The woman who sees far creates marks that map their journey, not the physical geography of valleys and rivers, but the emotional landscape of hope and despair, the spiritual coordinates of a people learning to navigate by stars they cannot see. Her symbols tell the story of leaving, of walking through grey waste, of finding warmth in the earth's deep places, lines that struggle and bend like people carrying burdens too heavy for human shoulders, circles that expand and contract like hope that grows and shrinks with each day's discoveries, dots that scatter and gather like the fragments of a people trying to hold together against forces that would tear them apart. The young man who sings creates symbols for sounds, not letters that will one day spell words, but marks that capture the essence of melody, the rise and fall of rhythm, the way joy sounds different from sorrow when it emerges from human throats. His marks dance across the pori, stone-like music made visible, creating the first sheet music for songs that exist in frequencies older than language. But perhaps the most powerful symbols come from the mother whose milk has returned, whose infant grows stronger each day in the warm air of the cave. She creates marks for love, for the bond between parent and child, for the way humans care for each other when the world forgets how to be kind. Her symbols are simple: two circles that touch, lines that connect and support, dots that cluster, like family gathered around fire. Yet in their simplicity lies complexity that will take philosophers thousands of years to unpack. Her marks speak of sacrifice and devotion, of the way humans create meaning by choosing to care for others, even when caring costs more than they can afford. They tell stories of women who give milk when their own bodies are starving, of children who share warmth with elders, of communities that persist because individuals choose connection over self-preservation. The symbols begin to interact, to combine in ways that create new meanings from the marriage of old ones. Fire and water become steam, the breath of the earth that saves them. People and journey become exodus, the movement of souls through landscapes that test everything they believe about survival. Love and hunger become sacrifice, the mathematics of caring that allows some to live because others choose to give. They discover that symbols can carry time, can hold past and future in the same mark. A circle can represent the sun that once warmed their ancestors and the hope that it will warm their children. A line can show both the path they have traveled and the direction they will take when the time comes to leave this sanctuary. A dot can be both the individual and the community, the one and the many held in the same simple mark. The cave walls become a library written in smoke and charcoal, a collection of knowledge that grows more complex with each passing day. But this is not knowledge as future humans will understand it. Facts stored for retrieval, information preserved for transmission. This is wisdom made visible, understanding pressed into stone by people who know that symbols can carry weight that words sometimes cannot hold. They draw to remember warmth when the world is still cold. The marks become a technology of memory, a way of holding on to experiences that might otherwise fade like breath in frozen air. When the grey days above feel endless, they can look at symbols of sun and grass and remember that such things exist, have existed. They will exist again when the earth finishes its conversation with the mountain's angry ghost. But they also draw to imagine, to create possibilities that have never been, but might someday be. Symbols of plenty in times of hunger. Marks that show humans and animals living in harmony that memory cannot recall. Images of skies that are blue, water that runs clear, forests that grow green and tall toward heavens that remember how to shine. The act of creation becomes as important as what is created. In the focused concentration required to make meaningful marks, they rediscover the part of being human that goes beyond survival, beyond the desperate calculations of calories and warmth that have governed their existence since the mountain screamed. They find again the joy of making something that did not exist before, of taking raw material stone and charcoal, and the movements of hand guided by mind, and transforming it into meaning. The children learn by watching, by trying, by making their own marks, alongside those of their elders. They develop symbols that speak of things the adults have forgotten: wonder at steam rising from water, delight in echoes that bounce through cave passages, the way shadows dance when firelight flickers. Their marks remind the community that even in the darkest times, humans can find reasons to create beauty, can discover magic in the simple act of being alive. As the symbols multiply and complexity grows, something unprecedented begins to happen. They start to tell stories in marks alone, to create narratives that can be read like tracks in snow or signs in the sky. The old woman creates a sequence that shows the journey from highland cave to thermal sanctuary, a visual epic that captures not just events but emotions, not just what happened, but what it felt like to live through the impossible. Others add to the story, creating their own sequences that show different perspectives on the same events. The symbols become collaborative, communal, a way of weaving individual experience into collective memory. No single person owns the story, it belongs to all of them, grows through their combined contributions into something larger than any one mind could hold. And in this communal creation, in this marriage of individual vision and collective wisdom, humanity takes another step towards something that will define them for all the ages to come. The ability to share complex ideas across time and space, to leave messages for people not yet born, to build knowledge that transcends the limitations of single lifetimes. The fire burns bright in the warm cave, and around it, humans make marks that will outlast the ash, that will survive the grey winter, that will carry forward the memory of a time when the world nearly ended, but people chose to keep creating meaning from the materials at hand. In the beginning was the mark, and the mark was with humans, and the mark was the first word in a conversation that will continue as long as minds exist, to read meaning into the marriage of intention and stone. 6 years after the mountain screamed, the sky begins to remember blue. Not all at once, the change comes like dawn after the longest night, so gradually that days pass before anyone dares to believe what their eyes are showing them. But slowly, inexorably, the grey veil that has covered the world since the ash began to fall grows thinner, more translucent, shot through with colours that have lived only in memory and dream. The 17 who entered the warm cave have become 43. Children have been born in the heated chambers, their first breaths drawn in air that tastes of minerals and hope rather than ash and despair. The young ones know no world, but this sanctuary, beneath the grey waste above, have never seen sky that stretches infinite and blue, have never felt rain that falls warm and clean from heavens that know how to smile. But the change begins in small signs that those who remember the time before can read like a language written in light and air. The woman who sees far, now marked by years of leadership and the weight of keeping hope alive through the darkest seasons, notices first that the steam rising from the cave mouth seems brighter against the sky. The eternal twilight that has pressed down on the world like a grey blanket shows patches where something lighter tries to break through. The water in the underground streams runs differently too, carrying scents that speak of snow melting somewhere in the high places, of ice breaking up in rivers that have been frozen solid since the ash began to fall. Fish appear in the pools, not just the sluggish creatures that have survived in the warm springs, but quicksilver forms that speak of waters where life has returned to its ancient rhythms. The first time they see actual sunlight, not the pale disk that has glowed weakly through ash-heavy air for 6 years, but actual golden rays slanting through the cave entrance, the children stop their play and stare with the wonder of those witnessing miracles. They have heard stories of such light, have listened to tales of warmth that falls from the sky like invisible rain, but seeing it, feeling it touch their skin with heat that requires no fire to create, they understand for the first time what has been lost, what might now be returning. The adults gather around the fire that has burned without interruption for 6 years, and in the dancing flames they see something new, the possibility of leaving, of returning to a world that might once again be capable of sustaining life. The cave has been sanctuary, womb, the warm darkness that allowed them to survive humanity's closest approach to extinction. But it has also been prison, beautiful and life-saving, but still a barrier between them and the vast world that calls to something deep in human DNA. The debates that follow carry the weight of decisions that will echo through generations. Some argue for staying, for remaining in the safety of the thermal sanctuary, where food and warmth are guaranteed, where children can grow without fear of starvation or cold. Why risk the uncertainty of a surface world that might still be hostile to human life, they ask, when the cave provides everything necessary for survival? But others hear different voices calling from beyond the warm chambers. The woman who sees far speaks of dreams that have visited her, sleep visions of grass growing green again, of animals returning to landscapes that have stood empty and silent for too long. She tells of a restlessness that has grown in her bones, a certainty that their time in the earth's womb is drawing to a close, that they are meant to emerge into whatever world awaits above. The young ones, especially those born in the cave, feel the pull most strongly. They have inherited wanderlust in their blood, carry the genetic memory of ancestors who walked across continents, who followed herds and seasons, and the endless human hunger for horizons that stretch beyond the edge of sight. The cave, for all its warmth and safety, cannot contain the vastness that lives in human hearts. The decision, when it comes, emerges not from argument, but from consensus born of shared understanding. They will leave, but not all at once, not recklessly. Scouts will venture out first, test the world's readiness to receive them, map the possibilities and dangers that wait in the grey lands above. If the surface world can sustain life, they will migrate gradually, carrying with them everything they have learned in the warm darkness beneath the earth. The first scouting party consists of 3 volunteers: the young man whose songs have evolved into complex musical languages, a woman whose skill at reading weather signs borders on the prophetic, and one of the cave-born children whose lack of memory of the world before makes him uniquely suited to see the new world without the burden of comparison to what was lost. They emerge from the cave entrance on a morning when the light seems stronger than it has been since the mountain died, when the air carries scents that speak of growing things rather than just the mineral tang of heated stone. The world they find is not the green paradise of memory, but neither is it the grey wasteland of the worst years. It is something new, something changed, a landscape in the process of healing from wounds that came close to proving fatal. Trees grow again, though they are different from the forests that covered these hills before the ash fell. Hardier species that survived the nuclear winter now spread their branches toward a sky that shows patches of actual blue between drifting clouds. Grass pushes up through soil enriched by years of volcanic ash, creating meadows that glow with the strange beauty of renewal after near extinction. The animals that survived have adapted too, evolved in the crucible of the worst environmental catastrophe in human experience. They are smaller, more resourceful, capable of extracting life from conditions that would have killed their ancestors. Herds move across the landscape again, not the vast migrations of the time before, but groups large enough to sustain themselves, resilient enough to thrive in a world still marked by the mountain's angry gift. But perhaps the most profound change is in the climate itself. The grey veil is lifting, but it leaves behind a world subtly different from the one it covered. Rainfall patterns have shifted, seasons follow new rhythms, and temperatures fluctuate in ranges that require new strategies for survival. This is not the same Earth that humans dominated before the mountain screamed. It is a planet reborn, renewed, offering different gifts and demanding different wisdom. The scouts spend weeks mapping this new world, learning its moods and seasons, discovering what it offers to those who know how to ask the right questions. They find fruit trees that have survived by developing deeper roots, water sources that flow clear and clean, caves, and shelters that could serve as way stations for a people, beginning a new migration across landscapes that are both familiar and utterly transformed. When they return to the thermal sanctuary, their reports spark something that has been dormant in human hearts for 6 long years: the urge to move, to explore, to expand beyond the boundaries of safe spaces into the vast unknown that calls to something older than fear. The cave-born children listen with eyes that shine with reflected firelight, imagining horizons they have never seen, adventures that wait beyond the warm walls that have defined their entire existence. The exodus, when it begins, unfolds like music, not the desperate flight that brought them to the cave, but a measured movement that carries the rhythm of hope rather than fear. They leave in groups spaced weeks apart, carrying with them the knowledge accumulated in 6 years of survival, the symbols and songs and stories that will help them navigate the challenges of the new world. But they also carry something else: the memory of warmth in the deepest cold, the knowledge that even when the world seems to be ending, the earth itself holds sanctuaries for those who know how to find them. They carry the certainty that humans can survive anything if they remember how to help each other, how to share resources and stories, and the simple warmth of bodies pressed together against the dark. As the last group prepares to leave the cave, the old woman who first learned to make meaningful marks on stone creates one final symbol on the wall near the entrance. It is complex, incorporating elements from all the visual languages that evolved in the warm darkness: circles and lines and dots that tell the story of refuge found and survival earned, and the long journey from near extinction back towards something that might, eventually, be called abundance. The symbol speaks of cycles, the way endings become beginnings, the way death feeds life, the way the mountains' scream of destruction became the earth's whisper of renewal. It shows humans not as masters of nature, but as participants in patterns larger than any individual life, threads in a tapestry that includes every stone and stream and star that burns in the darkness beyond the world's atmosphere. They extinguish the fire that has burned for 6 years, but they carry coals with them, embers that hold the memory of flame, and the promise that light can be rekindled wherever humans choose to make their homes. The smoke rises one last time toward the cave ceiling, carrying with it the prayers and hopes of people who learn to survive the impossible and emerge stronger for the testing. The world they enter is painted in colors that exist nowhere in memory or dream. The sky shows patches of blue so intense it makes eyes water with its beauty, but it is shot through with clouds that carry traces of ash, streaked with colors that speak of an atmosphere still processing the mountain's gift. The light that falls from this strange heaven is golden, but somehow different, richer, more complex, as if filtered through experiences that have changed its essential nature. They walk across landscapes that pulse with new life, but life that has been shaped by the crucible of near extinction. Flowers bloom in colors that have no names, evolved in the strange light of the ash-veiled years. Trees grow in formations that speak of adaptation, their branches reaching toward light, in patterns that previous generations never needed to learn. The animals they encounter watch them with eyes that hold no memory of humans as threats or allies. They are simply another species sharing the reborn world, neither dominant nor dominated, but part of the complex web of relationships that emerges when ecosystems rebuild themselves from fragments of what came before. As they travel, they sing, not the desperate songs of the hungry years or the careful melodies of the cave time, but new songs that celebrate the marriage of ending and beginning, that find joy in the simple act of walking under skies that stretch infinite and strange above their heads. Their voices carry across valleys that echo with the sound of water running free again, harmonies that blend with the calls of birds whose own songs have evolved during the silent years. The young man who has become their songkeeper creates melodies that incorporate the rhythms of the new world, the different patterns of wind through changed forests, the altered music of streams that flow over landscapes, sculpted by ash and time. His songs become maps of emotional territory, guides for navigating the feelings that arise when refugees return to a homeland that has become foreign. They discover other survivors as they travel, small groups that emerged from their own refuges when the sky began to clear, people who found different ways to survive the years when the world forgot how to breathe. Each meeting becomes a celebration, a sharing of stories and songs, and the accumulated wisdom of communities that faced extinction and chose persistence instead. The reunions reveal the true scope of human survival, More than they dared hope had lived through the volcanic winter, not many more, but enough to ensure that the genetic bottleneck has not narrowed to the point of evolutionary dead end. They are still a species balanced on the edge of extinction, but the edge has widened enough to allow for hope, for the possibility of recovery and growth, and the gradual rebuilding of something that might, generations hence, become abundance. Each group carries its own variations of the symbols and songs and stories that evolved during the survival years. Like languages that develop in isolation, their cultural adaptations have diverged in fascinating ways. Some developed elaborate musical languages that encode survival knowledge in melodies that children can learn before they understand words. Others created symbolic systems so complex they amount to proto-mathematics, ways of calculating resources and risks that go far beyond simple counting. But beneath the variations lies something universal, the human capacity to create meaning from suffering, to transform survival into story, to find in the darkest experiences the raw material for art and wisdom, and the kind of deep understanding that comes only through enduring the unendurable. They share their discoveries with each other, trading songs for symbols, stories for strategies. The cave-born children learn about life in tree shelters, in coastal refuges, in mountain valleys where thermal springs created microclimates capable of sustaining small communities through the worst years. Adults who remember the time before the ash share their memories with those whose knowledge comes only from the survival years, creating a bridge between the world that was and the world that is becoming. As the seasons turn, and they do turn now, following patterns that are recognizable, even if they are not identical to the cycles that govern the world, before the scattered survivors begin to coalesce into something approaching tribes, communities, the beginning of what might eventually become nations. But these new associations are different from anything that existed before the mountain screamed. They are founded not on competition for resources, but on the shared knowledge of how quickly abundance can disappear, how precious cooperation becomes when survival depends on everyone contributing to the common good. The woman who sees far, now recognized as a leader not just of her original group, but of the growing confederation of survivors, speaks often of the lessons learned in the warm cave, of the symbols that carry forward the memory of humanity's closest approach to extinction. She tells of the importance of maintaining refuges, of preserving knowledge and resources against future catastrophes, of never forgetting how thin the line is between civilization and chaos. But she also speaks of hope, not the desperate hope of people clinging to life in impossible circumstances, but the mature hope of those who have seen the worst and lived to witness renewal. She tells of the strength that emerges from surviving tests that should have been fatal, of the wisdom that comes from learning to read the earth's moods and seasons, of the joy that follows any dawn you thought you might not live to see. The migrations continue, will continue for generations, as humans slowly spread across continents that are both familiar and transformed. They carry with them the fire that never died, the symbols that speak in languages deeper than words, the songs that remember both the darkness and the light that followed. And as they walk across landscapes painted in colors that have no names, under skies that show blue through clouds still touched with memory of ash, they sing the songs of return melodies that celebrate not just survival, but the human capacity to transform catastrophe into wisdom, ending into beginning, the mountain's scream of death into the earth's whisper of life renewed. The sun, no longer hidden behind veils of ash, rises each morning a little brighter, a little warmer, a little more like the star that once blessed a world green with promise. And in its light, scattered across the face of the earth, like seeds blown by winds that carry hope instead of poison, humanity begins again the long work of building civilizations that might, if they remember the lessons learned in the warm darkness, prove worthy of the gift of existence on a planet that knows how to heal even the deepest wounds. 10,000 years have passed since the mountain screamed, and humanity has spread across the earth, like seeds blown by winds that remember ancient stories. They carry within their blood the memory of 17 souls who warmed themselves around a fire in a cave that breathed with the earth's own life. They carry it in the structure of their DNA, in the genetic markers that speak of populations so small they could have gathered around a single flame, could have known each other's names and shared each other's dreams. Every human alive today descends from those who refused to surrender when the sky forgot how to be blue. In the highlands of what will one day be called Ethiopia, a young woman grinds grain with stones, worn smooth by countless generations of hands. Her movements follow rhythms older than memory, patterns passed down through bloodlines that stretch back to the first mothers who nursed children in caves warmed by thermal springs. She does not know that the genes in her cells carry the signature of survival, the molecular evidence of humanity's passage through the needle's eye of extinction. But sometimes, in the quiet moments between tasks, she feels something stirring in her bones, a restlessness that speaks of ancestors who walked across continents, who followed rivers through landscapes painted grey with ash, who carried fire from one refuge to another when the world was too cold for naked flame to survive in open air. The feeling comes without warning, a sudden urge to move, to explore, to seek horizons that stretch beyond the familiar boundaries of home. Across the Indian Ocean, on islands where the mountain once stood, proud and green, before it tore itself apart in the service of geological time, a fisherman casts nets into waters that have learned to be blue again. His skin carries the bronze of countless generations who lived by the sea's moods, who read weather in the color of waves, and found direction in the dance of stars. But in the structure of his blood runs the story of ancestors who fled across water when the earth itself caught fire, who survived because they chose the unknown ocean over the certain death of staying still. He pulls fish from waters that flow over the crater where a mountain died to teach the world about impermanence. The fish are descendants of survivors, two species that adapted to seas poisoned by ash, that learned to extract life from water turned acidic by volcanic gases. Everything that swims in these recovered waters carries the genetic memory of that time when the ocean forgot how to sustain life, when only the strongest and most adaptable managed to pass their genes forward to futures they could not imagine. In the forests of what will become Europe, where ice sheets are retreating toward polar regions that still remember the taste of ash, a hunter tracks deer through woods that grow different from any his ancestors knew. These trees evolved in the strange light that filtered through ash-heavy skies, developed root systems that could extract nutrients from soil, enriched by pulverized mountains. The very ecosystem is a descendant of catastrophe, shaped by forces that would have killed less adaptable life forms. The hunter moves with skills inherited through bloodlines that stretch back to those who learned to hunt in a world where prey was scarce, and every missed opportunity might mean the difference between survival and starvation. His ancestors passed down more than techniques for reading tracks and wind direction. They transmitted the deep knowledge of what it means to live on the edge of extinction, to make every arrow count, because there might not be materials for another. But the inheritance goes deeper than skills, deeper even than the genetic bottleneck that marks all human DNA with the signature of near extinction. In the cities that are beginning to rise from temporary camps, in the trade routes that follow paths first walked by refugees seeking shelter, in the early writing systems that grew from symbols carved in cave walls by people who needed to preserve knowledge for generations they hoped would survive in all of these, you can trace the influence of those who learned to live when living itself became an art form. The early settlements cluster around water sources with an intensity that speaks of collective memory, of lessons learned when rivers meant the difference between life and death. No human community builds far from water now, and when they do, they dig wells with the desperate efficiency of people whose ancestors died when springs went dry. The knowledge lives in their bones, in the way they unconsciously calculate distances to the nearest stream, in the reverence with which they treat every drop that falls from skies that took 6 years to remember how to rain. The agricultural techniques developing in fertile valleys carry the DNA of survival strategies learned when every calorie had to be fought for, when waste meant death for someone's children. These early farmers plant with the methodical care of people whose genetic memory includes seasons when nothing grew, when ash covered the earth so thickly that seeds could not reach soil capable of nurturing life. They save grain with religious intensity, store surplus with the paranoia of those whose ancestors survived because they learned to prepare for disasters that come without warning. In the growing cities, where specialists are beginning to emerge, potters and metalworkers and weavers who can devote their lives to crafts, rather than the daily struggle for survival. The innovation pace carries urgency inherited from times when creativity meant the difference between extinction and continuance. These artisans work with the focused intensity of people whose ancestors survived because they learned to make tools from bones and weapons from stones and fire from materials that should not burn. But perhaps the most profound inheritance shows in the way humans relate to each other, in social structures that prioritize cooperation over competition, that treat the sharing of resources as sacred duty rather than optional kindness. The early laws being carved into stone tablets speak repeatedly of obligations to care for strangers, to share food with hungry travelers, to offer shelter to those displaced by floods, or droughts, or wars. These are not abstract moral principles but genetic imperatives, behavioral patterns selected for by conditions that killed those who hoarded, while rewarding those who shared. The children born in these recovering communities carry in their cells the accumulated wisdom of 10,000 years of survival against odds that should have been impossible. They play games that unconsciously rehearse resource management, tell stories that encode lessons about cooperation and the importance of maintaining knowledge across generations. Their laughter carries echoes of voices that sang around fires when song was one of the few possessions that could not be lost to starvation or cold. A young mother in a settlement built where thermal springs once saved a handful of refugees nurses her infant while humming melodies that have been passed down through generations of mothers who sang their children to sleep in caves and by tay, shelters, and the open air of migrations that lasted decades. She does not know that her lullabies carry the genetic memory of songs created by people who had to learn new ways to comfort children when the world itself forgot how to be comforting. The baby she holds is descended from perhaps 3,000 humans who survived the volcanic winter that followed Toba's eruption. In his DNA, scientists, who will not be born for thousands of years, will read the story of humanity's closest approach to extinction, who will trace the genetic signatures that show how a species that once numbered in the tens of thousands was reduced to a breeding population smaller than many modern villages. But they will also read the story of resilience, of adaptation, of the human capacity to not just survive impossible conditions, but to thrive because of them. The genetic markers that speak of the bottleneck also tell of rapid evolution, of traits selected for by conditions that rewarded intelligence and cooperation, and the ability to innovate under pressure. The humans, who spread across the earth in the millennia following Toba, were not just survivors. They were the products of the most intense evolutionary pressure any species had ever endured and lived to tell about. In the trade goods beginning to move between settlements, in the ideas and techniques and stories that travel with merchants and explorers and refugees seeking new homes, you can trace the continuing influence of that time when all human knowledge was held by small groups scattered across continents that had become hostile to life. The urgency with which information is shared, the religious intensity with which knowledge is preserved, the way innovations spread from community to community, with speed that amazes even their creators, all of this carries the genetic memory of times when losing knowledge meant losing the capacity to survive. The languages developing in different regions carry words that have no equivalent in the vocabularies of species that never faced extinction. Terms for the specific kind of hunger that comes when the body begins to consume its own muscles. Concepts for the type of cold that penetrates bones and never completely leaves. Ideas about cooperation that go beyond simple mutual aid to encompass the spiritual understanding that individual survival is meaningless if the community dies. But they also carry words for types of joy that exist only for those who have survived what should have been fatal. The specific happiness of finding food when starvation seemed certain, the particular warmth of human contact when isolation threatened to become permanent, the indescribable satisfaction of watching children play in sunshine after years of wondering if sunshine would ever return. As the sun sets over landscapes that have learned to be green again, over rivers that run clear and forests that grow tall toward skies that remember how to be blue, The children of Ash gather around fires that burn with the memories of flames that never died. They tell stories they do not know are true, sing songs they cannot know were born in the warm darkness of caves, where humanity learned to transform survival into art. And in their voices, in their laughter, in the simple fact of their existence, lives the greatest miracle any species has ever achieved. The transformation of near extinction into abundance, the alchemy that changes catastrophe into wisdom, the deep magic that allows life to emerge stronger from pressures that should have crushed it into silence. They are the children of Ash, the descendants of fire, the living proof that hope can survive anything if it finds people willing to carry it forward into futures they cannot imagine but refuse to surrender. In the time when humans first learned to bury their dead with intention, when grief became ceremony and loss transformed into something approaching prayer, the earth beneath their feet held secrets that would shape every belief that followed. The old woman dies as autumn paints the world in colors that remember fire, her last breath joining the wind that carries leaves from trees that have learned to let go gracefully. She is the keeper of the deepest memories, the one whose grandmother's grandmother survived the time when the sky forgot how to be blue. In her final moments, as consciousness fades, like embers settling into ash, she whispers words in a language that predates agriculture, predates the written symbols that will one day become alphabets. The mountain still speaks. Her descendants gather around the still form with reverence that goes beyond simple mourning. They understand they are witnessing something unprecedented in the long story of their species, the death of the last human, who carries personal memory of the great dying, whose knowledge bridges the gap between survival and recovery. With her passes not just individual wisdom, but living connection to the time when every human decision carried the weight of species survival. They prepare her body with care that borders on ritual, washing her with water heated by fires that descend in unbroken lineage from flames that burned in warm caves when the world was grey. They wrap her in skins, prepared, according to techniques, passed down through generations of people who learned to treat every resource as precious, every skill as sacred. But as they work, something unprecedented begins to emerge from their grief, the sense that death might not be ending, but transformation. The young shaman, whose role in the community has evolved from practical healer to something approaching priest, feels the weight of the moment settling on his shoulders like a cloak woven from starlight and responsibility. He has guided others through death before, but always with the pragmatic acceptance of people for whom survival takes precedence over speculation about what lies beyond the final breath. This is different. This death carries meaning that extends beyond the loss of individual life into territory his ancestors never had the luxury to explore. She goes to join the mountain spirits, he says, and in speaking those words, creates something that has never existed before in human consciousness, the formal acknowledgement that death might be doorway rather than wall, that the departed might continue to exist in forms that transcend the material boundaries of flesh and bone. They carry her to a hillside where thermal springs create pockets of earth that remain warm even when frost covers the surrounding ground. Here, they have decided, she will rest in soil that breathes with the same life that sustained their ancestors through the darkest years. But as they dig, their tools strike something unexpected: worked stone, carved symbols, evidence of intentional burial from a time so distant it predates their oldest stories. The discovery stops their work, as surely as if they had struck the bedrock of the world itself. In the earth that should hold only their beloved dead, they find proof that others have stood in this place before them, have faced the same questions about mortality and meaning, have chosen to honor their departed with symbols that speak of beliefs more complex than simple disposal of the deceased. The symbols are weathered but recognizable circles that speak of cycles, lines that suggest journey, dots arranged in patterns that echo the star formations their ancestors used for navigation during the Great Migrations. But there are other marks too, symbols that have no counterpart in their vocabulary of meaning, carvings that suggest concepts their language has not yet developed words to hold. As they carefully excavate around the ancient burial, They uncover artifacts that speak of rituals whose purpose they can only guess at. Tools placed deliberately beside skeletal remains, their edges sharp, despite centuries in the earth. Shells from distant oceans, carried thousands of miles from their origins to rest beside bones that have long since forgotten the weight of flesh. Ochre stains that speak of pigments applied with ceremonial care, paint that has outlasted the skin it once decorated. But most profound are the arrangements of the bones themselves, not the random scatter of natural decay, but careful positioning that suggests the departed were prepared for journey rather than simple rest. Arms folded across chests in gestures that speak of peaceful sleep. Faces turned toward the east, toward the place where light returns each morning after the darkness of night. Possessions arranged as if the dead might have need of them in destinations that living minds can barely imagine. The young shaman kneels beside the ancient remains and feels something stirring in his consciousness. Not knowledge, but recognition. The deep certainty that he is encountering beliefs that his own thoughts have been moving toward without his conscious awareness. The questions that have troubled his sleep since becoming keeper of the community's spiritual needs suddenly find context in these weathered bones and careful arrangements. They believed, he whispers, though he cannot yet articulate what that belief might have encompassed. But belief itself is revelation enough. The understanding that humans have always sought meaning, beyond the immediate facts of birth and growth and death, have always yearned for explanations that transform random suffering into purposeful testing. They complete the burial of their own beloved dead with new understanding of what they are doing. This is not simply disposal of a body that no longer serves its purpose, but participation in a ritual that stretches back through generations of humans who face the same questions about mortality and meaning. They are joining a conversation that began when the first human looked at death and wondered if consciousness might survive the dissolution of the flesh that houses it. As they lower her wrapped form into earth that has held the dreams of the departed for longer than their calendars can measure, they speak words that have never been spoken, but feel as ancient as the stones beneath their feet. Prayers that acknowledge forces larger than human understanding, invocations that call upon powers whose names they do not know but whose presence they sense in the way sunlight falls through clouds, in the way water rises from deep springs, in the way life persists even when the world itself seems determined to end. Great spirits of the mountain that spoke in fire, the shaman begins, his voice carrying the weight of formal recognition, of beliefs, crystallizing into doctrine for the first time in human history. Great spirits of the earth that gave shelter when the sky forgot kindness. Great spirits of the ancestors who carried fire through the darkness and passed life forward to those who came after. His words give shape to feelings that have lived unnamed in human hearts since the first survivor wondered why they were spared when others perished, since the first refugee questioned whether their survival carried purpose beyond simple biological persistence. In naming the spirits, he creates them, or perhaps recognizes powers that have always existed, but never before received formal acknowledgement from the species they helped preserve. The burial becomes the first funeral in the modern sense, the first ceremony that treats death as transition rather than termination. As they cover the grave with stones arranged in patterns that echo the symbols found in ancient burials, they establish practices that will spread from community to community, carrying with them the revolutionary idea that existence might extend beyond the boundaries of individual life. But the spirits they invoke are not the distant gods of agricultural civilizations, not the anthropomorphic deities, who will one day demand temples and sacrifices and elaborate hierarchies of priests. These are spirits born from the specific trauma of near extinction, powers that emerge from the particular experience of surviving, when survival itself seemed impossible. The spirit of the mountain that spoke in fire, not a vengeful god, but a force of transformation, the power that destroys in order to create, that brings death as a prelude to renewal. The spirit of the earth that provides shelter, not a nurturing mother but a partner in survival, the planet that offers refuge to those who know how to read its moods and seasons. The spirit of the ancestors who carried forward the essential flame, not distant fathers but immediate presence, the accumulated wisdom of all who chose persistence over surrender. These spirits speak to people who understand that survival depends on reading the signs written in weather and wind, in the behavior of animals and the color of water, and the way firelight dances when storms approach. They are powers that reward cooperation and punish waste, that bless those who share resources and curse those who hoard while others starve. They emerge from the specific conditions that shaped humanity during its closest approach to extinction. As night falls over the new grave, as the community gathers around fires that burn with the blessing of spirits formally recognized for the first time, something unprecedented begins to emerge in human consciousness. The sense that their survival carries obligation, as well as privilege, that their existence serves purposes larger than individual happiness or tribal prosperity. The shaman speaks of the mountain's lesson that destruction and creation are partners in a dance older than continents, that endings make space for beginnings, that sometimes the world must be broken before it can be remade. He tells of the earth's gift, the warm caves that sheltered refugees, the hot springs that provided sanctuary, the mineral wealth that sustained life when the surface world forgot how to be generous. But most importantly, he speaks of the ancestors' covenant, the understanding that those who survive catastrophe become custodians of wisdom, earned at the cost of everything they once believed about the world's stability. Their descendants inherit not just genetic material, but spiritual obligation, the duty to remember what it costs to persist when persistence itself becomes heroic. Around the fire, children listen with the intensity of those who sense they are receiving inheritance more precious than any material wealth. They hear in the shaman's words the first formal articulation of beliefs that will shape every religion that follows, every attempt to find meaning in suffering, every effort to transform survival into something approaching sacred duty. The spirits that emerge from this moment are not gods in any sense that later civilizations will recognize, but they are something perhaps more powerful, the formalized acknowledgement that existence itself carries meaning, that survival is not accident, but achievement, that consciousness persists, not because it is immortal, but because it chooses to honor the struggles of those who came before. As the fire burns lower and voices fade into the vast conversation of night sounds, the newly recognized spirits settle into the landscape like morning mist, becoming part of the air itself. They take up residence in the warm springs that still bubble with life, in the caves that remember the sound of human voices, singing against the dark, in the bones that rest beneath soil, enriched by ash from mountains that died to teach the world about impermanence. And in their presence, humanity takes another step towards something that will define them for all the ages to come, the capacity to find meaning in suffering, to transform catastrophe into wisdom, to believe that consciousness serves purposes larger than individual survival, and deserves to persist even when the world itself seems determined to end. 15,000 years after the mountain screamed, the world weeps tears of ice. The glaciers that grew thick and heavy during the volcanic winter have become monuments to cold, walls of frozen water that stretch across continents like the bones of a sleeping giant. But now, the giant stirs. The ice that has held the northern lands in its grip for millennia begins to remember what it means to flow, to melt, to surrender its ancient burden back to seas that wait with patient hunger for the return of their stolen water. You can hear it beginning a sound like distant thunder that never quite arrives, like the earth itself learning to breathe again after holding its breath for longer than human memory can measure. Deep within the ice sheets, pressures that have built for thousands of years seek release through cracks that spread like silver veins through crystal hearts. The tears that fall are not the gentle drops of spring rain, but torrents that could drown civilizations. A young hunter stands at the edge of what his people call the endless white, watching water cascade from the face of ice cliffs that rise higher than mountains. The waterfall before him carries more volume than any river he has ever seen, more power than any force he has ever witnessed. The sound it makes is not the music of normal water finding its path to the sea, but the roar of a world transforming itself, reshaping the very foundations of geography. His grandfather told him stories of the time before the ice, when green valleys lay where now only frozen waste extends to horizons that blur into sky. The old man spoke of animals that lived in those lost places, great herds that moved like living rivers across grasslands, now buried beneath ice thick enough to crush mountains. But the young hunter has lived his entire life in the shadow of glaciers, has known no world but one where ice defines the boundaries of possibility. Now, watching water flow in volumes that boggle comprehension, he begins to understand that change itself might be the only constant, that the ice that has dominated his world since birth is not eternal fixture, but temporary visitor, guest that has overstayed its welcome, and now prepares to depart, with the same dramatic flair that marked its arrival. The waters carry more than just melted ice. In their turbulent flow moves the accumulated debris of millennia stones ground to powder by glacial pressure, soil scraped from valleys and mountainsides, the compressed remains of forests that died when the world grew cold. The rivers that form from glacial melt run thick as blood, dark with the pulverized bones of landscapes that existed before ice learned to conquer continents. But the rivers carry life as well as destruction. Fish swim upstream in numbers that darken the water. Species that survived the ice age in refuges now venture into newly opened waters. Birds follow the flowing water in clouds that block the sun, their calls creating symphonies that celebrate the return of habitat. The expansion of possibility, the promise of abundance in places that have known only barren cold. The communities that have learned to live at the edges of ice face choices that echo the decisions their ancestors made when ash fell from angry skies. The safe places, the established patterns, the hard-won knowledge of how to extract life from frozen ground, all of it becomes obsolete as water reshapes the world they thought they knew. Villages that have stood for generations find themselves in the path of floods that arrive without warning, carrying ice blocks the size of buildings on currents too powerful to resist. A council gathers in a settlement built where hot springs create pockets of warmth, even in the heart of ice country. The elders speak in voices heavy with the weight of decisions that will determine whether their people join the ranks of the extinct or adapt once again to conditions that test the very limits of human flexibility. Their words carry the rhythm of survivors, the cadence of people who have learned that the Earth's generosity comes wrapped in packages that can kill those who fail to read the warning signs correctly. The ice speaks of leaving, says a woman whose scars tell the story of decades spent reading weather in cloud formations and wind patterns. The waters rise like the breath of awakening. Giants. We must choose. Move with the change, or be consumed by our refusal to acknowledge what our eyes tell us about impermanence. Her words echo with wisdom inherited from ancestors, who survived because they learned to see opportunity hidden in catastrophe, who understood that evolution demands motion, that staying still in a changing world is just another form of choosing death. The debate that follows carries forward arguments that have shaped human survival since the first refugee faced the choice between familiar danger and unknown possibility. Some advocate for following the water, for building boats and learning to live on rivers that change their courses daily, that carve new channels through landscapes freed from ice for the first time in geological ages. Others speak of moving inland, of seeking high ground where floods cannot reach, where the chaos of transformation cannot threaten communities that have already survived more change than any human generation should have to endure. But as they debate, the ice makes the decision for them. A sound like the world cracking in half announces the collapse of an ice dam that has held back a lake the size of an inland sea. The water that escapes moves with the speed of avalanche, the power of earthquake, the inevitability of time itself, finally claiming payment for debts too long deferred. The flood that follows reshapes geography in hours, carves canyons that will endure for millennia, creates lakes where once dry land stretched toward horizons, now drowned beneath waters that reflect skies, freed from the weight of eternal winter. Trees that have waited centuries for soil to thaw find themselves submerged before they can celebrate their liberation. Animals that have adapted to specific elevations discover that elevation itself has become fluid concept, that the rules governing survival have changed faster than evolution can respond. But humans adapt because adaptation itself has become their defining characteristic, their signature contribution to the conversation between species and environment. The flood that destroys villages also creates opportunities, new rivers to follow, new lands exposed as waters recede, new resources uncovered as ice retreats, to reveal landscapes that have slept beneath frozen blankets since the world learned to be cold. A young mother carries her infant across waters that yesterday were solid ground, following paths that exist for only hours before currents shift and create new routes through the chaos of transformation. Her feet find purchase on stones that have not felt sunlight since her ancestors first learned to make fire from flint and tinder. Each step carries her family toward futures that cannot be imagined, because the very foundations of geography are being rewritten in real time. She sings to her child as she walks, melodies that blend traditional lullabies with improvisations inspired by the sounds of water reshaping the world around them. Her songs become maps of emotional territory, guides for navigating feelings that arise when everything familiar dissolves into liquid possibility. The baby in her arms represents not just individual hope, but species continuity, the latest link in a chain of survivors that stretches back through ice ages and volcanic winters to the first humans who learned that persistence itself is a form of prayer. The groups that survive this latest transformation do so because they have inherited more than just physical adaptations. They carry cultural genes that encode flexibility, social structures that prioritize collective survival over individual comfort, stories that frame change as opportunity rather than threat. Their ancestors taught them to read the signs written in wind and water, to understand that the Earth's moods follow patterns larger than human lifespans, but comprehensible to minds trained to think in geological time. They develop new technologies born from immediate necessity, boats that can be assembled quickly from materials that float, disassembled just as rapidly when conditions demand overland travel, fishing techniques adapted to waters thick with sediment, nets designed to catch food in currents too turbulent for traditional methods, navigation systems based on landmarks that change daily, wayfinding that depends on reading the subtle signatures of water movement rather than fixed features of stable landscapes. But perhaps most importantly, they develop new stories, narratives that incorporate the latest transformation into mythologies that help human minds process changes too vast for individual consciousness to hold. The ice becomes a sleeping giant awakening from dreams that lasted longer than empires. The floods become tears of joy as the earth celebrates its liberation from frozen bondage. The destruction becomes necessary clearing, the removal of obstacles that prevented new forms of abundance from taking root. Children born during the Great Melting grow up understanding that change itself is the only reliable constant, that adaptation is not crisis response, but normal operating procedure for species. Wise enough to read the signs correctly, they play games that rehearse resource management under fluid conditions, tell stories that celebrate flexibility over strength, sing songs that find rhythm in chaos rather than order. The settlements that emerge in the aftermath of glacial melting are different from any human communities that came before. Built on principles learned from surviving transformations that should have been fatal, they prioritize mobility over permanence, cooperation over competition, innovation over tradition. Their success is measured not in accumulated wealth, but in adaptive capacity, in the speed with which they can respond to conditions that change faster than memory can catalogue. As the last great ice sheets retreat toward polar regions where they will wait for the next geological cycle to call them south again, humanity stands at the edge of a world remade. The maps drawn by their ancestors are useless now, made obsolete by waters that carved new coastlines, rivers that chose new paths to the sea, mountains that emerged from beneath ice, thick enough to hide continents. But they have gained something in exchange for the lost familiarity, the deep knowledge that they are part of a planet that thinks in scales too vast for human comprehension, that participates in cycles of change that dwarf the brief flicker of individual lives. They understand now that their survival depends not on controlling these forces, but on learning to dance with them, to find rhythm in transformation, to discover opportunity in apparent catastrophe. The ice weeps its way toward the sea, carrying with it the compressed history of ages when the world knew how to be cold. But in its tears swim fish that remember warmer waters, and on its shores gather humans who have learned that resilience itself is a form of worship, that adaptation is prayer made manifest in the physical world. The sound of melting ice becomes the Earth's lullaby, a song that speaks of cycles within cycles, of endings that nurture beginnings, of a planet that knows how to heal even the deepest wounds given enough time and the right conditions for renewal. In the quiet spaces between heartbeats, in the pause between one breath and the next, memory lives. Not the memory of minds that catalogue experience in words and images, but the deeper memory that lives in bone and blood, in the spiral structure of DNA that carries forward the compressed wisdom of every ancestor who chose survival over surrender. Every human alive today is a walking library of endurance, a living testament to the ancient fire that refused to die even when the world itself forgot how to breathe. You carry within your cells the memory of 17 souls who warmed themselves around flames that burned in caves where the earth's own breath provided sanctuary. You carry the genetic signature of populations so small they could have gathered in a single room, could have known each other's names, and shared each other's dreams. In the rhythm of your pulse lives the echo of hearts that beat through the darkest winter any species has ever survived. Close your eyes now, and feel it stirring that deep recognition that connects you to every human who has ever drawn breath under stars that remember the taste of ash. In the warmth of your skin runs blood that carries molecular memories of cold so profound it should have stopped the circulation of life itself. In the expansion of your lungs moves air that descends in unbroken lineage from the first gasps of children born in thermal springs, when the surface world had forgotten how to sustain anything warm-blooded and hopeful. The fire never truly went out. Even when the last wood had been burned for warmth, when the final embers seemed destined to fade into ash and memory, someone always chose to carry coals forward into whatever dawn might come. Cupped in hands that had learned to treasure heat more than gold, protected in vessels made from the bones of extinct giants, the essential flame traveled through landscapes that looked like the surface of a dead moon until it found new fuel, new reason to burn bright against the consuming dark. This is the forgotten fire, not the dramatic blaze of destruction that announced the mountain's death, but the quiet persistence of human will, when will itself becomes the only resource that matters. It burned in the eyes of mothers who gave their portions to children, in the determined steps of those who followed rivers through grey wastes, in the careful hands that shaped symbols on cave walls, when language itself had to be reinvented for a world without precedent. The fire burns still, though you may have forgotten how to see its light. It flickers in the moment when strangers help each other without thought of reward, when cooperation emerges spontaneously from shared recognition of common vulnerability. It glows in the instinct that makes humans gather around light when darkness falls, that draws communities together around sources of warmth that serve as focal points for stories and songs, and the simple comfort of knowing that consciousness is not alone in its brief dance through time. You can feel it stirring when you hear certain sounds, the crackle of wood yielding its stored sunlight to flame, the whisper of wind through spaces that echo with the memory of human voices, the distant rumble of thunder that carries echoes of the mountain's scream across valleys of time. These sounds wake something in your bones, some deep recognition that your ancestors survived forces that should have been fatal, that you exist because others chose to persist when persistence itself became an act of faith. The fire lives in the way humans cannot resist reaching toward light, in the automatic response that turns faces towards sunrise, even when sleep still weighs heavy on closed eyelids. It burns in the universal human hunger for warmth, not just the physical comfort of heated air, but the emotional warmth of connection, understanding, the knowledge that individual consciousness participates in something larger than the boundaries of single lifetimes. In laboratories yet to be built, scientists will read the genetic signatures that speak of humanity's passage through the needle's eye of extinction. They will trace the molecular evidence of populations reduced to numbers so small that every human alive today shares ancestors who could have fit inside a modest building. The DNA analysis will reveal the biological bottleneck, but it cannot capture the spiritual expansion that occurred when humans learned to find infinity in the space between one heartbeat and the next. The fire grows brighter in moments of crisis, when individual comfort becomes secondary to collective survival. It blazes in the phenomenon that emergency workers know, but rarely speak about the way disasters bring out. Not the worst in human nature, but something approaching the best, the instinctive understanding that helping others survive increases everyone's chances of seeing another dawn. This is genetic memory made manifest, the behavioral inheritance of ancestors who lived through times when cooperation meant the difference between continuation and extinction. You carry their wisdom in reflexes. You never had to learn the way your eyes automatically search for shelter when storms approach, the instinct that makes you conserve resources even when abundance seems assured, the deep understanding that treats every source of warmth as precious, every drop of clean water as a gift from powers beyond human control. These are not conscious thoughts but genetic instructions, behavioral programs written into your cells by generations who survived because they learned to read the subtle signs that distinguish safety from danger. The forgotten fire burns in the human compulsion to tell stories, to transform experience into narratives that can survive the death of those who lived them. Every tale told around every fire, from that first night in the warm cave to this moment, now is part of the same continuous story, the story of consciousness that refuses to accept that meaning ends when individual lives conclude, that insists on passing forward the accumulated wisdom of survival, even when survival itself seems impossible. It glows in the way humans cannot resist, making marks that might outlast their makers, symbols carved in stone, paintings pressed into cave walls, words that capture the essence of experience in forms that can survive the dissolution of the flesh that created them. This compulsion to leave traces, to speak across time, to audiences not yet born, carries the genetic memory of times when preserving knowledge meant preserving the possibility that anyone would survive to receive it. The fire illuminates the deep human understanding that individual existence gains meaning through connection to something larger: family, tribe, species, the vast web of life that includes every creature that has ever drawn breath under stars that have witnessed the birth and death of countless worlds. This knowledge lives not in conscious thought, but in the cellular memory of ancestors who survived because they chose the group over the individual, because they understood that in times of ultimate testing, the continuation of consciousness itself depends on the willingness to sacrifice personal comfort for collective survival. You breathe with lungs that remember air, thick with ash. You see with eyes that carry the genetic memory of skies, the color of pewter. You think with a brain shaped by the neural pathways of ancestors who learned to find hope in circumstances that should have extinguished all possibility of hope. The very structure of your consciousness bears the imprint of minds that chose to persist when persistence required more courage than any individual should have to possess. The forgotten fire burns in the way small kindnesses echo across generations, how acts of generosity create ripples that spread through time and space, to touch lives that will never know the names of those who chose compassion over self-preservation. It glows in the understanding that survival is not individual achievement but collective accomplishment, that every human who has ever lived is part of an unbroken chain of choice and sacrifice, and the stubborn refusal to surrender to forces that seem too large for human resistance. In the deepest sleep, when conscious thought releases its grip on waking concerns, the fire burns brightest. Dreams carry you back to caves, where your ancestors sang against the dark, where they painted symbols that spoke of hope, when hope itself had become a luxury no one could afford. In sleep, you remember what it feels like to be part of a species balanced on the edge of extinction, to understand that your very existence is miracle, made manifest in flesh and bone, and the electrical storms that create consciousness from the marriage of chemistry and starlight. The fire will continue to burn long after the last human voice falls silent, long after the final symbol fades from the last wall that remembers the touch of human hands. It burns in the structure of the universe itself, in the way matter organizes itself into patterns complex enough to support consciousness, in the tendency of existence to create beauty and meaning, and the kind of love that chooses to preserve life, even when life itself seems determined to end. Rest now in the warmth of that ancient fire. Feel it burning in the rhythm of your pulse, in the gentle expansion and contraction of lungs that breathe air, sweetened by the exhalations of forests that remember how to grow green, towards skies that have learned again to be blue. You are the echo of those who refuse to vanish, the living proof that consciousness can survive anything if it finds vessels willing to carry it forward into futures they cannot imagine, but refuse to surrender. The fire burns, has always burned, will always burn, and in its light, the story continues. One breath at a time, one heartbeat at a time, one choice at a time. To persist when persistence itself becomes the highest form of prayer. Listen now. Can you hear it? The whisper of wind through grass that grows where glaciers once carved valleys deeper than memory. The gentle lapping of waves against shores that emerged when ice wept its way back to polar dreams. The soft rustle of leaves on trees whose roots drink from soil enriched by ash from mountains that screamed their secrets into skies that learned, eventually, to forgive. These are the sounds of a world healing, slowly, patiently, with the kind of time that makes human lifespans seem like single heartbeats in the vast conversation between Earth and stars. You are here because someone chose, in the coldest hour of the darkest night, to carry fire forward into a dawn they could not see. You breathe because a mother shared her last milk with a child who had no names for the colors that would one day paint his children's dreams. You think because minds that should have surrendered to despair chose instead to carve meaning into stone, to sing hope into the wind, to believe that consciousness itself was worth preserving even when the world forgot how to sustain anything warm and alive and beautiful. 74,000 years ago, when the mountains split the sky and painted the world grey, 17 souls found refuge in a cave that breathed with the earth's own warmth. 17. Out of perhaps 10,000 who had walked beneath stars that remembered when the world was young. 17. Who became the ancestors of every human voice that has ever spoken love into the darkness. Every human hand that has ever reached toward light. Every human heart that has ever chosen to beat one more time when beating itself became an act of courage. You are the echo of those who refuse to vanish. In your DNA, written in molecular ink, that time cannot erase, lives the signature of survival, against odds that would make mathematics weep. Every cell in your body carries the compressed wisdom of ancestors who learned to extract life from conditions that should have been fatal, who discovered that cooperation is not convenience, but necessity, who understood that individual existence gains meaning only through connection to something larger than the boundaries of single lifetimes. They are with you still, these ancient survivors, in the way your eyes automatically seek light when darkness falls, in the instinct that makes you share food with strangers, in the deep understanding that treats every source of warmth as sacred, every drop of clean water as blessing, every breath as gift from powers beyond human comprehension. When you gather around fires, whether they burn in fireplaces or campgrounds or the candlelit tables where friends become family, you join a circle that stretches back 74,000 years to the first night when humans learned that light shared is light multiplied, that warmth given freely returns tenfold, that stories told in darkness become torches that illuminate the paths of those who come after. The cave still breathes, somewhere in the highlands where thermal springs rise from depths that remember the Earth's molten heart. Scientists may never find its exact location. Archaeologists may never uncover the symbols carved by hands that shaped meaning from desperation. But it exists, not just in geography, but in the spaces between human heartbeats, in the pause between question and answer, in the silence that holds the seeds of every song that will ever be sung by voices that refuse to surrender to the consuming dark. You carry that cave within you, the warm refuge that shelters consciousness when the world grows cold, the sanctuary where hope survives, even when survival itself seems impossible. In moments of deepest quiet, when the day's noise fades into the vast conversation of night, you can feel it stirring. That ancient recognition that you are part of something larger, older, more enduring than the brief dance of individual lives through time. Sleep now. And in sleeping, remember that you are made of star stuff and stories, of carbon forged in the hearts of dying suns and wisdom, earned by ancestors who faced the end of everything they knew and chose to begin again. Remember that your existence is not accident, but achievement, not coincidence, but the culmination of countless choices to persist, when persistence required more courage than any human should have to possess. Remember that every breath you take, every beat of your heart, every dream that visits your sleeping mind is part of an unbroken chain of consciousness that stretches back to the first humans who looked at extinction and said, softly, but with voices that could be heard across geological time, not yet, not today, not while there is still fire to carry, still stories to tell, still children to love into a future we cannot imagine, but refuse to surrender. The mountain's scream has faded to whisper, then to silence, then to memory held in stones that witnessed the transformation of catastrophe into wisdom. The ash has settled into soil that nurtures forests. The ice has retreated to dream in polar regions. The sky has remembered how to be blue, how to hold clouds that promise rain instead of ash, how to frame stars that shine with light, that began its journey when the world was young and will continue long after the last human voice joins the chorus of ancestors who chose hope over despair. You are their living legacy, their breathing prayer, their answer to the question of whether consciousness can survive anything, if it finds vessels willing to carry it forward into tomorrows that exist only in the realm of possibility. Rest now, in the warmth of that ancient fire that burns still in the rhythm of your pulse, in the gentle expansion of lungs that breathe air sweetened by the songs of birds whose ancestors learned to fly again when the grey veil lifted, in the quiet spaces where dreams gather like morning mist that will burn away to reveal landscapes painted in colours that have no names, but need none to be beautiful. You are here, you are breathing. You are thinking thoughts that connect you to every human who has ever existed and ever will exist in the vast conversation between matter and meaning, between chemistry and consciousness, between the darkness that would consume everything and the light that refuses, always refuses, to be extinguished. The story continues, one breath at a time, one heartbeat at a time, one dream at a time, carried forward by voices that whisper across time. We remain, we endure, we remember, and in remembering, we ensure that the fire never truly dies, that hope survives, that consciousness itself becomes the ultimate act of rebellion against a universe that thinks it can end stories that choose to continue. Sleep, and in sleeping, join the vast dreaming of ancestors who carved symbols of hope into stone when hope itself had no words, who sang lullabies to children when the world forgot how to sing, who carried fire through the longest night any species has ever survived and handed it to you, warm and bright and eternal, to carry forward into whatever dawn awaits beyond the horizon of now. The fire burns in you, through you, because of you, forever. We who remain, we who remember, we who carry the ancient light forward into whatever darkness awaits, knowing that light shared is light multiplied, that love given freely returns tenfold, that consciousness itself is prayer made manifest in flesh and blood, and the electrical storms that create meaning from the marriage of chemistry and starlight